Hello, this is the Great Canadian Bagel. We have another lovely podcast for you today. I'm joined with Wyatt Claypool, and we're going to be discussing a lot of things here, but primarily related to polling, and specifically, we're going to lead in here with this one kind of conspiracy that's bubbling through, which is kind of wild, but I'll let this little video clip speak for itself.
Here's the deal. I'm not a conspiracy theorist.
So are you saying something?
I was about to say before we get into it, I think I should preface for people that this will be the smuggest man you've ever met in your entire life. Creek Pete here, in case you want to look him up on TikTok later.
A realist. I look at things and make my own judgments, just like everybody else. But I'm going to say straight out, I think polls are bullshit. And I'll tell you why. I'll show you why I came to this conclusion. It's been something that I've been saying for a while. But they are definitely being used as a tool for manipulation right now. And when you see that poll after poll after poll is coming out every second day, basically now, there has to be a motivation behind that. Also, you have to look at who's doing this polling, right? And which polls are being pushed on us. So, here's my conclusion. They're fucking bullshit, and I'll show you why. Here's the man, Angus Reid himself, retweeting far-right loons on Twitter. Shame on Trudeau, completely unacceptable to legitimize church burning. Because that happens, right. Trust this guy's polls? I think not. Here's David Coletto. He's a pollster for Sun News. For sure. Here's David hanging out at the Manning Center. For sure. I trust this guy. For sure. Totally not biased. These guys are totally non-biased pollsters that we should totally believe. Okay, you could do what you want. You could believe the polls all you like, but don't let them manipulate you into believing a narrative that isn't necessarily the truth. Okay?
So the crazy.
Sorry. I was going to say this man has seemingly never seen a crosstab in his life on who's being polled. It's pretty transparent who's being polled, and I don't know what he means by manipulation.
What you see, what this guy is getting at is he's getting at a lot of things that you see all the time, when especially on Twitter these days, is people conflate a whole bunch of wild things. Like, oh, why are all these pollsters polling so frequently? They're trying to sway public opinion. No, the reason why, we'll just go over here to the polls. These are all the polls in Canada for federal. These are the 2024 ones. The reason why you see so many firms, including brand new ones like this Relay Strategies, or these old and long-lasting firms have been around for cycles and cycles, why they poll so frequently, oftentimes once to twice a month, depending on the pollster, is this is advertising. These election polls are advertising. Main Street Research makes its money. Yes, they sell subscriptions to their polls and they get some money from that. But they overwhelmingly make their money by doing market research for companies or the government. And the way they can convince companies or the government that they should pay for Main Street Research as market research is by showing, hey, look, our polls are really close. Look at this election here. We were really good. We predicted it. It's marketing. That's why they do it so often. There's no perverse incentive of trying to bolster or suppress a political party. The perverse incentive is that these companies are trying to make money. So they want to poll frequently and to be accurate because that's how they advertise.
And the extent to which you can actually manipulate people with polling is extremely minimal. You really can't swing a race with polling disinformation unless it was a race absolutely on a knife's edge and you could truly make people believe that their candidate was about to lose by 10% and there's no point in showing up. But even then, there's other pollsters usually around to show that that's complete nonsense, and I really doubt if there's been that many elections in the past 100 years that would have gone the other way if it weren't for one poll that was put out. And again, no company, no polling firm is going to risk its entire reputation trying to swing a race. And again, he brings up Angus Reid, and then he pretends like the church arson epidemic isn't real. Yeah, I know that recent one was a construction site fire, and it wasn't an arson that time, but there has been a spate of arsons. But because Angus Reid and David Coletto happen to be more conservative people, I'm not even sure if David Coletto's exactly conservative.
I don't think he is.
Yeah, or Sun News employed him. That just means that Sun News needed a pollster, and Abacus Research or Abacus Data was available. Because again, it's not like they are not asking him to do right-wing polls. He does polls. You can even look down south in the U.S. MSNBC's pollster, I forget what the guy's name is, but a lot of these guys who do polling for CNN, MSNBC, Fox, they tend to be very honestly more center left, no matter what the news station is, or sometimes they even seem a little bit to the right of the normal editorial because they're just pollster guys, and they hire them because they have good numbers, and the news stations like to advertise their numbers. One, because they get to write stories about it, they get to do news broadcast segments about it, and they like the reputation that our news broadcaster is, trusted because we have good, accurate polling.
I'll show two really good examples of this right now. So we have CNN here, usually considered a center left-leaning firm. Harris is +1. We have New York Post here, usually considered like center right-leaning newspaper. Harris +4. That's because the pollster that New York Post is paying is getting one result, and the pollster that CNN's paying is getting a different result. And actually, CNN's pollster is usually pretty good for the U.S., for the record. They usually make pretty decent polls. But
News actually be more Democratic leaning than CNN's or ABC.
And there's other ones too. I don't recall if they're all labeled. Like ABC News usually pays for Ipsos, and they get a different number. And you get different pollsters, you get different methodologies, you get different numbers, obviously. But the news companies, like for example, Sun News, they're paying for Abacus data. Why is Sun News paying for Abacus data? It's probably not to convince people that the conservatives are going to crush. It's probably they're trying to sell newspapers, and people like to read about polling and election stuff, and this sells newspapers, but people aren't going to buy those newspapers if they're wrong or they're like egregiously bad. So Sun News has a perverse incentive to sell you newspapers that are trying to be accurate, or else you're not going to buy them anymore. At least their polling issues.
Even if they have conservative commentary, they want that conservative commentary to be backed up with accurate information about what's going on. Everyone is incentivized that direction unless you're like truly such a partisan propagandist that you're almost setting up a news company just for the sole purpose of manipulating one election and then moving on, which I don't believe really ever happens outside of like maybe Chinese type interference where truly whatever is being done is only to manipulate. You're never going to have a long-term, like you're not going to have a firm that exists for a long time who takes part in manipulation. They quickly get laughed out of it, out of the business. That's frankly, I think what's happened with Sovereign North in Alberta and BC. Sovereign North was polling obviously for the United Party before they took a dirt nap, and they showed that United had like 15% of the vote in British Columbia. And it was obviously not true, and even it was embarrassing for United that was the best result that Sovereign North could get them. And Sovereign North probably was just like they probably just got asked by United to put together a poll that gives them a realistic, not too bad result. And even to get to that, if you looked at the crosstabs, and the crosstabs tend to not lie unless the person's just literally making things up, in which, they're going to get discovered if they're doing a bad job. The crosstabs in the Sovereign North one were like only people above the age of 60. It was laughable.
Yeah, I have it here on screen, and you can see, like, for example, male 18 to 34 Vancouver area. There's a lot of males 18 to 34 in Vancouver area. There's 3 of them, and they're all undecided. What? Females 18 to 24. There's 10 of them, and they're mostly undecided. Or they're heavily undecided. They're 3 of 10. So, like, and you go through the rest of this poll. You get, like, for example, other BC. There's literally there's one person in 18 to 24 males. And I just want to impress upon you how hard it would actually be to get this few 18 to 24 males organically. When I run my own polls, which I have one that I'm about to publish recently, I get inundated with 18 to 24 males. And yes, you can say different sampling methodologies, but like if your sampling methodology can't get these people through online polling, you're really bad at it. And this is an online poll, I believe. Oh, landline and mobile numbers. Okay. But still,
landline.
That's also kind of its own, like you call in mobile numbers, you're not getting 18 to 24 males, they're going to answer the phone.
Yeah.
So it's pretty
But
dubious.
this is like one of those instances where people, you look at the poll result and you're like, yeah, sure it is, because it just, your own basic common sense knows that it's wrong. And guess what? People pointed and laughed at it. If Angus Reid or David Coletto at Abacus Data were doing a laughably bad job, it would be the subject of tons of news coverage, tons of people making fun of how bad their crosstabs were and how obviously inaccurate it is, and how everyone just from existing knows that, like, let's say if they were saying that the Conservatives were at 60% in Toronto, you would just go around with a microphone and make fun of them by seeing how long it would take you to come up with, like, a bunch of Conservatives in downtown Toronto. Which even these days with the Conservatives polling better, it would be extremely mixed. It would not be 60%, but obviously no one's putting out those numbers. Well, and how does that guy, like Creek Pete there, how do you square the fact that Frank Graves, Nick Nanos are also putting up good numbers for the Conservatives? Frank Graves hates Conservatives, like with a passion. He hates them. That's why he includes those extra results that are actually manipulated, trying to show that Conservatives believe in disinformation, because he only polls them on questions, like on issues where there's of the possibility for Conservatives to believe something that's quote unquote untrue, because even in a lot of his questions it's just based on your interpretation of what he means by the specific question. Like when he says Canada has the fastest growing GDP in the G7, raw GDP, sure, but most people don't think in terms of raw GDP. They think in terms of, are people getting better personally, or like personal per capita GDP? Are people doing better off every single year, and are they growing in terms of their wealth? And that's not true for Canada.
He seemed to have taken it down on his website, actually, these disinformation questions. It's kind of funny.
Well, honestly, it probably was because people were making fun of him for it, because it's provably not correct.
But for example, though, to speak about the Abacus one, so this is the most recent Abacus data poll. And you look at these cross tables, and these are pretty much, for the regions, the same that every other pollster's saying. And even among these, like, for example, this Saskatchewan Manitoba cross table, I'm not saying it's impossible. This could definitely happen. But this would be a very interesting result if something like this happened, because this would be almost a zero swing from 2021 to 2024. It'd be like 4 points or something like that, top of my head, which is not impossible, but it'd be a very interesting result considering Alberta, beside it's moving 7 points more conservative. So,
and we just had a by-election in Winnipeg that showed the Conservatives growing. That's the one area where the NDP have still strength, so you'd assume that the NDP would have contracted a little bit if Winnipeg ridings tightened up.
yeah, I've been tracking the by-elections, and I believe let me try to pull it up here. 1 second. Why would you have things prepped up when you can think about them on the fly?
Okay, it makes it more interesting. It makes us feel dynamic to people watching.
So I queued up. This is the 3 by-elections in Manitoba. So this is essentially a poll of 85,000 people across a rural community, a suburban community, and then kind of half suburban, half like core downtown community. And we get the Conservatives are up to like about, if you compare this to 2021, we should be seeing something like 25% Liberal, 49% Conservative, 19% Liberal, or NDP kind of stuff. Which, if that's happening in Manitoba, then Saskatchewan would have to be doing abysmal to only have 56% between these two provinces. Again, I'm not saying Abacus data is necessarily wrong, but it would be a very interesting result.
And this is where the more minute, the more specific, I guess, the thing that you're looking at, the weaker the polling tends to be. This is actually a big thing in British Columbia that we can get to on why right now the polling is looking really good for the Conservatives, especially when you factor in that certain groups just don't take polls. It's very difficult to get certain groups on polls. Even this one that we're looking at right now, right there from Abacus, that one was showing, I don't need you to have it on screen for too much longer, but even Alberta, I really doubt that the Liberals are only going to get 7%. It's just that if you're a Liberal in Alberta, and this is how response biases happen, you're probably a pretty demoralized voter if you're a Liberal in Alberta. And I've door-knocked solid Conservative ridings. Like, again, when I was running for the federal nomination in Calgary Signal Hill, you do bump across some Liberals every single day you go out. It's not just 7% of people who are even Liberal. in a riding like that. And so 7% doesn't make sense for the entire province, but Liberals are probably not picking up the phone to take a poll or even doing one online if they're in Alberta. It's almost depressing to know that you're basically the one person in like 150 who is being polled in Alberta who's actually going to say Liberal.
There's also a consideration too there. Now, there's two main sources of systematic polling error, and this is not like the pollsters are being fraudulent or they're trying to skew results. This is just this polling error emerges because of the inability to actually get these people to answer the phone or answer an online poll. And the first group, this is the most obvious group, it's very rural, farming type people. People who work in farming communities, work in very remote mining towns or logging towns, stuff like that. They don't answer polls very frequently. Partially because maybe they don't have very good internet access, or they're busy during the day so they don't pick up the phone. Maybe they don't have very good cell reception. There's all sorts of possible reasons why they don't do it, but they don't answer the poll or the phone very well. So you get situations like this in the Alberta election where you routinely have all these polls, every single poll here, underestimated the UCP's lead. And you break into the cross tables, which I'm not going to do here because it take too long. And I did them in the postmortem, if you remember back to that.
And to be clear, it was a close election on seats because everything really came down to Calgary. But yeah, these polls are trying to be accurate when it comes to the actual popular vote. And you have places like Council Public Affairs, who's also polling in British Columbia, saying +5 BC Alberta NDP. It was like 8.6, as people can see on screen, that the UCP won the popular vote by 8.6. So they had a 13.6% miss. That's borderline. You're not even polling the same universe.
So what happened here in Alberta, which most of these firms except Janet Brown, because Janet Brown, if you talk to her, she tells you exactly what I just said. A lot of these rural voters are hard to get on the phone, hard to get to answer an online panel. But she goes really hard out of her way to get these people on the phone, and lo and behold, she gets these people, and her poll's almost dead bang on.
I had her come to one of my classes when I was taking my public policy master's degree, and she even said that you have to call. We start calling at 4 different times a day: 9 a.m., 11, noon, or I think it was 9, noon, 3, and 7. Because again, if you're a farmer, you're not going to be taking polls at the same time other people are taking polls. If you're an office worker, same difference. If you're a tradesperson, a plumber, no chance you're going to get them during the middle of the day to take a phone call unless you just happen to catch them at the 15 minutes they were eating right before they get to their next job. Whereas if you're a public school teacher, you are probably far more likely to pick up a phone poll, at lunch at school or during the evening or the day. Some jobs are more stressful, or they tire you out more, and you just don't want to talk to somebody. And this actually happens all the time in the United States, where Republicans underpoll because you're not going to get a lot of these rural white working class men to take a Georgia state presidential poll. And so it ends up underestimating it, making it look like the Democrats are doing better in rural areas, when those rural areas you're pulling school teachers. And you can even just tell, because you're no way Coffee County moved blue. The registrations in the state for more people registering as Republicans than previous years prove that would be impossible, that Coffee County's moved, or at least extremely unlikely.
So that's one of the big sources of polling error that you see. And it's the biggest one. It's by far the most dramatic one in pretty much every jurisdiction, because for example, in Alberta in 2019 or 2023, I don't have 2023 data, sorry, for the 2019 election federally, the communities that are overwhelmingly farming towns broke conservative by an 80-point margin. So if you get too few of them answer your poll, you will dramatically skew your results. Because if you have 20% of the population of Alberta breaks conservative by an 80-point margin, and you don't get them on the phone, it's gonna make it look like the rural part of Alberta is a lot more NDP or Liberal than it actually is, which is what happened in this election. But the other big source we see too, and the Main Street CEO, Keto Maggie has talked about this before, and also other people like Kyle J. Hutton, if you ever see him on Twitter, have talked about this before. It's in very, very, very urban areas, and it's specifically renters are really hard to get on the phone accurately because they move so much. It's very hard to get an accurate sample of people who are currently living in this riding because you get so many more unknowns then. So basic picture this, like you have a riding, it's like, let's say 50% of people are renting, and 25% of them every 4 years have moved to a different riding. It's now very hard for you to plot the swing on how people's vote intentions are changing because you're getting an influx of people who are completely new. They're different people. It's very difficult. That's not impossible.
And by the way, racial minorities are also more likely to be living in dense urban centers. You don't get a lot of people who move to Canada then immediately move to like Steinbach, Manitoba, or some other rural area. Obviously, it does happen. But so not only do you have the renters and a lot of people are moving in cities, but you also have demographics of people who are just more skeptical about taking polls, and it's really not part of the culture of like that it's been baked into middle class North America that you pick up the phone and you're willing to take some call from somebody doing survey research.
Mm-hmm. And the other tricky thing with that too, specifically with new immigrants, is you don't know, like they're new people. They probably didn't vote in the last election. Period. End of story. So then you have a whole new wrinkle that they're new voters, and now you have to try to estimate what percentage of these new voters are actually going to vote, and what percentage of voters are these new voters going to actually be. And as someone who's done polls before, this is a very tall task. It's very difficult to handle new voters. You have to handle it, obviously, or else your poll makes no sense. But it's a lot simpler to handle repeat voters than it is to handle new voters. And because urban centers have a much higher degree of new immigrants coming into them, they're much more complicated to handle because there's much fewer repeat voters because of that.
And that's what puts such a big question mark on the British Columbia election, because the key demographics that are shifting the most, at least by the word of people on the ground, and I can back this up that this is true, that it's East Asian and South Asian voters whose voting patterns are likely to be the most different compared to any other group. So like white voters are going to be more consistent, and minority voters are going to be the ones that are most likely to change, because the BC NDP and the BC Conservatives are actually still pretty tight when you look at crosstabs from different pollsters on where white voters are going. And white voters, because they're very likely to pick up the phone, if polled 1,300 people, probably 1,000 to 1,100 of those people are white, even though based on the proportion of the population in BC, that's actually a massive disproportionate overpoll in a certain sense. So then it's people like or like firms like Leger and Abacus and Main Street, they have to upweight the South Asian and East Asian samples. So they'll pull 1,000 white people, but only 45 South Asians will take the poll, and only 38 East Asians will take the poll, which makes it almost like you have to now interpret, okay, is this an outlier? Because we only polled 35 people, and if like one or two people say green in this poll, it actually makes the Greens look like they're doing crazy good. But it's only 2 people said yes, but it's just a massive proportion.
I'll just give a good example of this right now. This is a Main Street poll. This is an old one. But for example, the weighted quota is 38 for East Asians, but they had 25 respondents. 24 Middle Easterners, 4 is the quota, 14 responded. 1,039 whites responded, quotas of 989. So you have this kind of thing. And yeah, you can do statistics. You can do all sorts of stuff like this to upweight or fill in gaps in data and do all sorts of fancy, sophisticated things. But at the end of the day, if your core sample is half of what you need it to be, it's more prone to being fluky. You have a higher margin of error. And then you get more noise. If you look at these, if you pay for Main Street's polling and you regularly look at these ones that are not old, you'll see like the bounciness and the noise in the racial demographics that they report is crazy because the samples are low because these groups just don't respond to polls, at least as same much as everyone else does.
As somebody who also gets the Main Street polling numbers in detail, pays for them, you will have variations with South Asian voters who I'm always looking at, because obviously there's a lot of ridings where South Asian voters are like a good 20 to 30% of the population. And one poll will say BC Conservatives at 58% in that group, or 50%, and that's with an undecideds taken into account. And then another poll will only say 36, and then 42, and then 30, and then the NDP is up at 50 or whatever. And it's just demonstrative of the fact that and it's like some people do say certain minority groups are more likely to swing hard in elections, so maybe that's what's happening. But I don't generally think that day to day people are swinging like this. It's just low sample sizes have massive errors.
That's a very good big one. So like, we'll just scroll back up here. So this poll has 1,200 person quota. And if you do the math on that, let me just bring this up on my other screen. I don't actually want to show this publicly because I'm not ready to release the data, but this is from the poll I've been actually running myself. Wrong screen. You get a sample. That's not the right numbers. There we go. You get a sample of like 20 people. Your margin of error can be as high as 20 percentage points. So let's say this overall number here, this 44 to 42, has a sample of 20. This means that the NDP could be anywhere from 24% to 64%. So if you start seeing a 40-point swing day to day, that's actually expected because the margin of error is that high. Because the sample size is very low. But in the case of the BC election, this sample size, or this sampling of things like the South Asian population, the East Asian population, matters a lot because they're heavily concentrated in the ridings that myself, 338, Main Street, if you pay for their model, are projecting to be the swing ridings in this race. So you have a very small percentage of the population that's quite hard to pull, that has huge margins of error on it, and they're making up a very large percentage of the swing voters in the swing ridings. So it makes this election very complicated, on top of every other issue that makes this election very complicated.
And here's another thing, and somebody even mentioned this to me yesterday. It actually might have been Kudo himself, when I keep telling people, and it is accurate, but it's not as accurate as I might have previously thought. And I always tell people, like, this is probably the most undecided election in British Columbia in the last 30 years, which is true. In other elections, people were way more rigid with where they were going to be placing their vote. Like a lot of lifelong NDPers just kept voting NDP. A lot of lifelong BC Liberals kept voting Liberal, and then the Greens always kind of picked up that in the middle anti-establishment voter who usually, oftentimes, the Greens votes every single election are mostly at least half new, because it's just a party that doesn't have a solid base of support. It depends on where it's even running candidates, because oftentimes there's a good handful of ridings where they don't even have a candidate. But what Kudo even mentioned to me, and it's a good point, that oftentimes elections are not nearly as undecided as you think. Depending on what candidate or party we're talking about, voters are more likely to tell you if they actually like them, or they'll just say, I'm undecided. And they're almost playing coy. And it's always because there's usually one option in the election which voters are more likely to not want to directly say their opinion on. And this happened in the US, where they detected that there's the shy Trump voter. Somebody's voting Trump, but they just keep saying, I don't know, well, I'm undecided. And that might be also going on in BC right now. There's a lot of I don't know conservative voters.
You see this kind of thing too. I can just give an anecdotal example of this. So I was out canvassing the day of recording of this video, and the neighborhood we're canvassing in, like most parts of the riding I live in, was overwhelmingly Liberal win at the precinct level in 2021. And I'm canvassing door to door knocking, and obviously I'm going out with the Conservative Party because I'm supporting Joel Hurdle, the candidate here. And you see people overwhelmingly. There's three groups. You have the people who are like really don't like, usually Pierre Poilievre, and say, nah, we don't like Pierre Poilievre. Then there's people like, aha, we really support you. And then there's lots of undecideds. And you end up getting very, very few people who say they're going to vote like Liberal or NDP. And obviously there's going to be many of them. There's no way that there's going to be like single digit number of votes in this precinct. That's ridiculous. That's not going to happen. So what's happening is, since we are coming as the Conservative Party, they're looking at us and like, oh, wait, I don't want to tell you who I'm voting for. So what is this to say is the perception of the polling firm and the perception of the people, or the perception of if they're embarrassed by their choice, like maybe they're just embarrassed to be voting for Trudeau. They don't want to say it to somebody to their face, but they are going to vote for Trudeau. Or in the case of BC, maybe people don't want to say they're voting for Rustad, but they are. Or maybe they don't want to say they're voting for EB, but they are. We don't know. We'll know on election day. Usually in Canada, I would say it's a safe bet to assume the Conservatives will overperform polling, but it's not necessarily true. We will see.
And this is where you made a really good point the other day in your video on the BC polling of why what you called not smear, but a slander politics or slander marketing or advertising, why it doesn't really work. And what it might achieve is making people less likely to say that they're voting Conservative because the BC NDP are like attacking them as running crazy candidates and all the stuff that's, like, you know, from my perspective, inaccurate completely. But it's also just not helpful even to the NDP, because the thing is, there's a lot of people who will maybe clam up about the fact they're voting Conservative, but it's hard to get somebody in their actual like heart to stop voting the way that they're going to vote. And I experienced this the other day when I was in the riding Port Moody Burquitlam, who, depending on the polling model, it's either going Conservative or it's going NDP. It's a big toss-up. I think I asked you, and you had it in your model going blue. And I was in one of the more NDP-heavy precincts, like polling districts, from 2020. And the thing is, you could even tell, because everyone at the door would even say, yeah, this is a very NDP community. Like, this is an area in 2020, it was all NDP signs, if anyone did have a sign. It's a more white area, and I always find white people are very difficult to get them to put up a sign sometimes, especially upper middle class people. But in this area, I would have tons of people at the door say, you know, I don't like David Eby. I think this government's gone so radical, especially since Horgan stepped away. And they'd be saying, yeah, I'm voting Conservative. And then they would tell me, the rest of the neighborhood's very NDP. You might not get a lot of good responses. And they'd even sometimes specifically point at a house, like, I wouldn't buy they're going by there. Not that the person was rude, but they're like, they're very NDP. It's probably not worthwhile. I'd go to that house, and that person would say the same thing to me. You know, David Eby's like too much of a socialist, don't like him. You know, I'm voting Conservative, but I think those other people, they're all voting NDP, you might be wasting your time. It was funny. It was like in a single day of just 2.5 hours, 3 hours of door knocking, like 5 or 6 houses would start off with the whole, like, we're default NDP voters, and then by the end you'd figure out they're actually voting Conservative.
Yeah, it's a very interesting phenomenon there. People have, what's the word for it? So, like, you'll see this occasionally with polls, where polls will ask, like, who do you think is going to win the election? And that's there's another variant of that poll where people are like, who do you think your neighbors are going to vote for? And what's very interesting about this is that none of these questions are very correlated. So, like, who you think is going to win the election is not actually that correlated with how people are voting. There's a lot of people who right now are not voting Conservative, obviously, because they're not everyone is voting Conservative. But more people think the Conservatives are going to win the election than are voting Conservative. Or more people, if you ask their neighbors, might say, my neighbors are voting NDP than they actually are. Because a lot of the stuff is really built on, like, the neighbor question, right? That is based on previous behaviors from previous conversations from previous elections. So it's usually 1 or 2 cycles out of sync with what's actually going on. But if you ask who's going to win, then it's not the same thing as a vote intention, because you're talking about basically who has momentum. That's a momentum question.
And it makes sense that it's you as an individual. You assume that the thoughts that you have are very unique to yourself, especially when you're going from something like voting for a lefty trade unionist party like the NDP to an actual pretty conservative, like more conservative than the federal conservatives, the provincial conservatives, although most provincial conservative parties are naturally more conservative than the federals, often just because of the types of policy they touch on that the federal government doesn't. But everyone assuming, because it's such a big change, I'm going from voting this lefty party to this right party, that must be like unique. That must like make me like a weird pariah in this neighborhood because everyone votes NDP, and you don't realize that your thoughts are actually not that unique. Everyone is still reacting to the exact same, economic and social stimulus that's come out of the results of the current government being in. And there's a lot of people who are going to have the exact same path, they're going to have the exact same way of thinking about the vote. If you door knock thousands of doors, you eventually find out there's a certain number, a defined number of types of people that you bump into. Everyone's a unique individual, obviously, but there's a reason why you don't start to get you develop stereotypes in your head as soon as the person opens the door. I can tell you probably 5 things about this person and how they're going to talk to me just by how they're dressed.
There's another interesting related thing to that, and this is something that my wife came into a lot during university, because she went to law school in a fairly, not outrageously so, but a fairly liberal college in Canada. And oftentimes she would, there'd be like a default point of view being discussed in class. And this isn't like an objective thing, it's just like an opinion on the law. Not like this is what the law says. It's like this is what we're discussing about the law. We're having a discussion about it, right? And she would take, I guess, a more conservative legal view stance on what the law should be or is. And when just debating against the rest of the vocal part of the class, who would take a more liberal view of the law, because it's more, again, a more liberal law school. But then after the class, she would have lots of people who were quiet be like, oh, yeah, I agreed with you. And the reason I say this is you see this phenomenon happen quite a lot, where people have this really wrong view of how everyone else acts based off of how a very small number of vocal people act. So, quote unquote, the silent majority meme in here, I think it's kind of a really silly thing to assert, the silent majority thing. But the general principle is true. A lot of people will think that they are an outlier or a weird social exile when they're actually more normal or more common than they think they are, because no one else who thinks like them speaks up.
Well, this is why you have purple wave memes from many of the bigger PPC cheerleaders, just because they assume because all of your friends on social media, even though you can run into every type of person on social media, because you can kind of create your own bubble, people will genuinely start to believe that the PPC is going to win seats, even though even the best polling would indicate, yeah, no, this is a thinly spread out 8-9% of the vote, and then we're talking like before the 2021 election polls, that all the data should be telling you to be pretty bearish on your chances, but because you only talk to PPC people, you couldn't imagine that people are going to be voting. And that actually happens even today with a lot of liberals online, that they used to be so dominant, and it's even harder for them to break out of this mindset because their party can win seats, that they can't believe that Poilievre's actually popular, because they only interact with people who think that every single bad thing about Pierre Poilievre ever said is true, which obviously it's not. But you'll have all these people posting every single day that all Canadian women, like the vast majority of Canadian women, don't like Pierre Poilievre. It's like, it's just not true. Just look at the polling. It's just like it may be, even if you don't trust the polls, talk to people. You're not going to get that many people who actively even hate anyone who isn't the current prime minister. It's really hard to hate somebody who's like an opposition leader.
Well, that's a very interesting point to bring up. People have this really wrong idea, especially from this. This is an actual thing that polls kind of propagate. Now, Abacus is actually the best pollster for this, and Wyatt and I have talked about this before. But people have this wrong view that this negative number of impressions means that you hate Justin Trudeau, or aha, I'm negative to Jagmeet Singh, 39%. 39% hate him. No, 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 no. 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 60% of the population in Canada does not hate Trudeau. 60% of the population just doesn't like what he does. That's a very different thing altogether. Hate is a kind of an irrational emotion in the objective sense of the term emotion and rational, whereas being like, oh, I don't like this guy, I don't like what he did, it's a very rational thought. And these are very different motivations and actions.
And that's why over time your approval ratings can change. If people had either were like absolutely in love with you or hated you, you could not probably convince people over, because people tend to have a pretty big like people are really not like willing oftentimes to change their most extreme opinions. Not extreme in terms of like you know, it's a wild opinion, but I mean in terms of intensity. There's not that many people usually willing to say, "Oh, I was completely wrong about the guy I was like steaming mad over." This goes up and down because, like, I would say 50% of the country has temporary feelings about political leaders. That's why Jagmeet Singh's approval ratings actually change a lot. It really depends on what he's doing. And I think also, even though again, Jagmeet Singh's politics are super out of step with most Canadians, that's why he used to have a very positive approval rating, even further back than this their poll goes. That he used to have a really good approval rating. Usually, NDP leaders do, even though they have very left of the norm type politics. It's just because you don't think about these guys too hard, so why hate them? And that's the general feeling for like Justin Trudeau up until recently. I would say that there was a good amount of people who do hate the guy, but it's still not the entire just like disapprove bar hates him. But like if you go back 3 years or so, especially during COVID, where he's like people are like, oh, he's trying his best. That would actually probably be like a majority opinion if you like talk to people. They're like, well, I don't like him all the time, but I think he's trying his best. A lot of people have very almost sometimes frustratingly mild mannered opinions about things that there was very clear cut facts on. But that's just because most people don't pay attention to politics the way you think they do. That's where social media advertising and even television advertising can only get you so far in an election. And eventually, do you have to talk to people directly or do direct, advertising through lawn signs or lip dropping? Because like there's people can be pretty surprisingly oblivious to what's going on.
I'll also just add too on the lawn sign to circle to put a nice little bow on the last two things I've added to this. One of the main benefits of lawn signs, or just a campaign putting up signs just on public property, what they're allowed to during campaign periods, isn't actually the direct first order effect. It's not to be like, aha, there's a conservative running in this riding. Most people assume there's going to be a liberal, there's going to be an NDP, there's going to be a conservative, there might be a green. Most people assume that those parties are going to be in each riding. The main benefit of it, and the reason why you see signage be really pushed, especially if you are being canvassed, they're like, do you want a sign on your lawn? It's not that the signs do anything per se. Like, people aren't going to vote for you because they see your sign. That's not really a thing. But what it does do is people who already are thinking of voting for you, it reassures them. They can go in a neighborhood and see, oh, look, my guy who I want to vote for, there's signs all over here. It reassures them. It helps them be like, oh, I'm not a weird snowflake that wants to vote for the only guy who wants to vote for Bob. Everyone wants to vote for Bob.
And that's what I even tell people when I'm one of those canvassers asking people if they want to sign. I even like my straight up answer. I always say when somebody's sort of unsure is I say the science of it is that generally speaking, if you put up a sign, you're going to get another neighbor who was on the fence about voting, and they're going to be like, oh, like Sharon's voting. Okay, I'll go vote too. Now, I mean, it's kind of one of those things where it kind of jars other people, like, oh yeah, other people take this election seriously, maybe I should take it seriously, because there are a good, depending on the race, 50 to 60%, or not quite 60, 40 to 50% people who aren't who don't vote. And so the signs give a sense of momentum and importance to people who usually maybe sit at home.
And it can be quite significant too. One of the big issues, for example, I'll just do a really niche one, but the Conservatives had in the riding of Halifax West in 2021 was that it took them a long time for various reasons that, first off, I can't say, and second off, are out of context of this video. It took them a long time to run a candidate, so they were like 2-3 weeks into the election before they had a candidate field. So a lot of people thought they just weren't going to run a candidate because there was no signs anywhere at all because they didn't have a candidate. So people were like, are the Conservatives not running here this year? That's weird. And it demoralized a lot of people. Like, oh, I guess we don't get a candidate. Feels bad.
Or they think their guy's just some paper candidate who's not taking it too seriously. He's drinking margaritas down at, the Cactus Club or whatever. He's not trying.
Mm-hmm.
That's and again, actually, here's another thing about signs. Oftentimes, you don't want all your signs up right away. You want to kind of have them dribble out during the campaign, because let's say you have in a provincial riding, it's actually pretty common to not have up more than a few hundred signs, because there's not that many people who really want one. Most people, it's not their personality to display their politics that openly. That's actually the thing that you'll notice in areas with more South Asian or Middle Eastern voters. They're not shy about letting you know who they're going to vote for if they do plan on voting. So I've been in election door knocking campaigns where every single house in Northeast Calgary in some neighborhoods had signs, and it's just the culture. People are very not showy in like a bad way, but they're very outward about what they think about things. But what you want to do is not have all your signs. Let's say you had 300 signs that you get requested in your riding on private lawns. You don't want them all up at once. You kind of want them to kind of slowly trickle out. Asking people at doors, running advertisements online, asking people if they want to register for one to get dropped off. Because people notice on the first day there's a few signs out, and then second day there's more and there's more and there's more, and it looks like the whole place is being slowly, organically convinced over to that guy's side rather than a bunch of signs go up, and it looks like, oh, that's the baked in support.
Yeah, there's all sorts of there's a lot of things in this world where at the surface level it looks really simple and really basic. Pretty much every job outside of like the most mundane job you can think of is the same deal. And like the most mundane job would probably be like the really stereotypical like assembly line that's like, I'm going to take apple from this conveyor belt and put it on that one. I don't think that job exists, but you get the idea, right? Like the most basic, most rudimentary thing you can think of. Now that worst person actually probably makes good money, but that's another thing altogether. But outside of something like that, most jobs have a lot more complexity than you think. Even something like basic like a cashier is more complex than a lot of people give it credit for. Or
I was about to say that was always actually the job where I feel like as a kid I kind of got it, because whenever I saw people like driving or operating a cash register, I'm like, how would I ever figure out how to do that? There's like so much going on right now. Because like, and if you ever have worked in retail, like, yeah, you couldn't just jump onto somebody else's cash register at a different store and just know what to do. Because if someone comes up with a coupon, you're screwed because you don't know what the button is to put it in, what the procedure is. There's a lot of nitty gritty nonsense you got to do.
yeah, if you look at one of the most remarkable things actually about, on speaking of cash, the self checkout machines, ignoring the fact that there's a really big concern of shrink with them that hasn't really been resolved yet. But the most remarkable thing about them is that they managed to distill the process of using a cash register and checkout counter to the point that like pretty much any person can do it with just minimal supervision, which is quite remarkable. Because that used to be full-time jobs for people. Like automation can be crazy at times. Mm-hmm. But to go back to the main point from this digression, most jobs are more complicated than people think, and people look at election stuff and be like, oh yeah, you just go talk to people, get them to vote, and it's like, well, no.
There's such a difference between good door knockers or just like people who've done it before, experienced, and actually like really good. there's like, rookies almost needing to go with other people, and by the end of a couple sessions, the best you can probably get them to do is follow a script and generally feel like what the person's currently feeling about the election. And experienced people, they're faster. They go to the doors, they get to the IDs, they know how to get to the point fast and get the information from the person. But like really good door knockers, people who can actually do persuasion door knocking, are like 1 in 100 on a campaign of somebody who can truly go to a door where somebody is even just on the fence and bring them over onto your side. Because I hear people talk to people all the time as I'm going around and door knocking in groups. I usually just go solo. I really just like going by myself. But whenever I'm with other people, I'll sometimes hear somebody get stuck with a voter and they're trying to come up with a reason why because the person's skeptical about what you're saying. And like in my mind, I'm like, no, this is literally the thing you should be saying right now to this person. And they're being a little bit too mealy mouthed. They're referencing about how well the other guys aren't doing quite a good job. Well, like that person doesn't want to hear that. I know they don't want to hear that. They want to hear that you have the idea, or it sounds like you're dodging. And you find all these little social bad indicators they're giving out just by the way that they're meandering too much. I'll hear politicians talking to a crowd of people, and I will interject in a way that almost comes off rude to the person at the time, where I'm saying, no, don't worry, we're going to scrap that. And the person's like, well, I was getting to it. I'm like, no, but you not getting to it fast enough made it seem like you're lying. That's what you have to know. You gotta say right away what you say, and then get to the miniature story that goes along with it, or it sounds like you're trying to gish gallop them or something.
Mm-hmm. And that's one of the big complexities with a lot of this stuff. And it pretty much every job where you're talking to people and your job is to talk to people can be very complicated. For example, I bought a car recently, and car sales, on the surface, like one sentence description, you sell a car to a person who walks into store. How hard can it be? Well, first off, there's dozens of other car manufacturers. Each person coming in has different needs for the car, and you have to try to convince them that your car is the one that uniquely satisfies their needs for based on like price or features or functionality or the whole package.
And it's not an impulse item that person has to buy now.
Yeah, very few people need to buy a car right now. They can leave. Most people who, if you talk to someone who's bought a car before and ask for advice on how should I buy a car, they'll tell you test drive a bunch of cars, spend a couple weeks, and then go back to one you like the best, and then try to negotiate. And that's tough for the car salesperson because you have to go at every point. You have to be trying to sell the car, but the person can just walk and you'll never see them again. But then with, like, for example, persuasion canvassing, where you're trying to convince people, one of the biggest hurdles with that, which makes it very difficult, is you'll have a voter, you'll have them at the door, they'll be talking to you, and you'll be like, oh, what issues do you care about? I don't really know. Or I've not paying attention, or I need more time to think. And then you start getting answers like that, and it's just, unless you know really well what you're doing, and I'll confess, I'm not the best at this, but if you don't know what you're doing exactly, you have no win. So you're just like, well,
And that's where I literally experience that all the time. I all my strategies count on the person saying I don't know, because that's the most likely answer. Even if the person knows, they'll say they don't know, because who can sum up? It's almost one of those nonsensical questions you ask. Hey, is there any big issues for you this year? And that's what I literally say. Any big policy issues? Any big issues for you guys? And they're like, oh, the usual stuff. And they say, oh, I don't know. And I always just say it's literally the most undecided election we've had in 3 decades probably now. And I always say, well, in a nutshell, what we're trying to do is, because it's more of a referendum than an election, since it's either you like the NDP government or you want the opposite. What we're trying to do, and I go into the issues themselves, and I kind of usually give people interesting tidbits about how crazy the polling's been. Only 65% of people who voted NDP last time are doing it this time, which is true. Depending on the poll, it's actually been lower than that some. And I always kind of make the person feel in on it, and now we're having a chat. I mean, I'm not telling them information, and some people always say, ask a lot of questions at the door. That, to me, is almost like that's like, it's almost too simple. It's one of those things that sounds about right, but it's not true at all. You don't ask the person at the door a lot of questions, because guess what? They're going to just, they're not going to answer one, they're probably not going to answer you at all because they don't know. And asking a person who doesn't know more questions is going to get things even more vague. I always throw out feelers. Talk to them like you're their friend and you've always been their friend. Not like we're all like goofing off or something, but just go right into it. And you'll be shocked how many people actually just start talking like you've just sat down in their parlor for coffee.
Just to add here, this is a Research Co poll. This is the most recent Research Co poll. This is the most friendly poll currently fielded for the NDP. And I don't mean like from a bias standpoint, I just mean like from the objectively, its sample is the best sample the NDP's had for a while. And 24% of 2020 NDP voters are voting Conservative, 3% are voting Green, and I guess 3% are doing something weird because these numbers don't add up to 100, or 1% is doing something weird because it does not add up to 100. But only 72% are staying with NDP, which is, again, the most favorable poll for the NDP in the last week.
And that's the death zone. As you've told me in the past, you should be 80 to 95% if you are an incumbent moving towards a confident re-election.
Yeah, generally speaking, because I've looked at a lot of polls, believe it or not, running a polling channel for 4 years, wow, crazy, right? Most parties who win elections, decisively win elections, usually maintain 80 to 90% of their base in Canada. If you start getting into the 70% range, you're looking at a very close election. And if you get below 70, you're losing. You're going to lose the election if you're below 70. Because most voters are voters, most of your current voters are voters who voted for you before. Crazy.
I think how insane that is for the BC NDP right now, because they've had the next step to the right party, the United, just leave. And so when you have a lot of people deciding, and to be fair, these numbers are saying 67%, 68% of people are voting NDP who did last time, which is very low. That still includes some undecideds, but I've noticed in the recent mainstream polls, only about 5 or 6 people are actually undecided in that category still. It's pretty low at this point. Most of the people are, have figured out if they're going to stick with them or not. And the BC NDP, the BC Conservatives are grabbing like 22, 21% of the 2020 NDP. And again, that's horrifying for the NDP because that's a pretty big step for an NDP voter from 2020 to be making. And then what do you think Liberal voters are doing? And if you actually do look at that, even though it's not even the same party, the BC Conservatives are winning the BC Liberal voters stronger than the BC NDP are winning their own voters from last time. And then you have to factor in the people who didn't vote at all last time, which I think is going to be a massive category in this race, simply because there wasn't really conservative options in the past. So a lot of federal voters who are non-provincial voters are probably going to turn out.
A good example of that is the BC Conservatives in 2020 in BC got 2% province-wide, but if you look at only the places where they ran candidates, I'm pulling a number off the top of my head, so it might not be 100% accurate, but if you look at only where they ran candidates, it was approaching 9% of the vote. So that implies 7 percentage points worth of British Columbians lean conservative, but would have voted for Trevor Boland's Conservative Party, but there actually wasn't a party to vote for because they didn't have someone run in the riding.
This is also, to really go on a tangent, this is what always drives me up the wall from proportional representation advocates when they think that it wouldn't completely upend what kind of people run in elections if we had pure proportional representation, where if you get the proportion needed for one seat, you get that seat. Look at all the tiny minor parties in the results section on Wikipedia for the 21 election. All these parties in the ridings that they did run in would win a seat if you just genericized that number across the country. And if you ran more candidates across the country, you'd actually probably increase per capita voting in the individual ridings, because people would be like, well, yeah, they can. They're running a candidate everywhere. Why not? And as a proportional representation system, you wouldn't even need a candidate. You just have the party brand running everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, again, let's take this 2020 BC election. I guarantee you, if you're talking about a province-wide vote where every party is eligible in every single part of the province, and it's just a matter of getting enough voters to get a seat, 187th of the vote, you would see a lot of people vote for the Christian Heritage Party. You would see a lot of libertarian voters. These parties would suddenly go from 8,000 votes to 50, 100,000 votes easily, because there's a lot of people who are socially conservative in BC, but are like, first off, they might not have a Christian Heritage candidate to vote for. They only ran 5. Or they might be like, well, there's no point in voting Christian Heritage. They're not going to win. I'm going to vote Liberal or something.
Well, I looked at the 21 federal numbers, and going into the next election with 343 seats or 338 before, that's like you only need less than a third of a percentage point to win. And like, look at all the ones, and they actually have statistics on the side of how well they did in the ridings that they did field candidates. And the Marxist-Leninist Party, the Communist Party, every single party would get a seat, and that's in an election where people are not voting knowing that if they get past that threshold, they could win. This is why proportional representation advocates drive me up the wall, because they're like, well, we'd have a 5% cap. Well, then so do you. There are arbitrary barriers even in your system. And it's always that they have a specific party in mind that they would want to win. They want to win more seats. They don't actually want the Marxist-Leninist Party to get seats. They don't actually want the Libertarian Party to start winning seats. They want their specific pet party who already has a somewhat broad approval in specific ridings to be able to win more ridings. And that's why I do like first past the post in a lot of ways. You have to prove that there is a specific big portion of people in a riding. It doesn't have to be the majority who passionately like you. And that's where Trudeau, in a recent interview with Nate Erickson Smith, who's another Liberal MP who does his own podcast while he's still a sitting MP, he would like, Trudeau was like, well, I'd like rank balloting. Like, of course it would benefit the Liberals because you're the middle party. And so as people go through ballots, but then you would end up with the Liberals getting 51% of the vote in a riding, and more than half of the people who voted for them down ballot don't even really care. I mean, once it's your second or third option, you don't even have that much invested in it. But you're overcoming potentially another guy who got 45% of the vote first ballot. Those people actually believe in him. And then he gets basically overcome by apathy.
Well, we all saw a great example this federally of what happens. We saw 2 examples, actually. When you do ranked ballot shenanigans like this, with Andrew Scheer and Aaron O'Toole, both of them only won because of ranked ballot shenanigans, where they got like the 3rd, 4th choice votes of candidates to push them over the edge. And Andrew Scheer's case, I think it was like the 15th choice.
There's literally 17 candidates, I believe.
And you look at something like that and you're like, can you really say that someone who ranked Andrew Scheer as the 15th best option is really enthused about Andrew Scheer being the leader, is really going to volunteer and donate money to the party because, we have Andrew Scheer as the leader of the party now. This is great. Like, probably not. Probably not. The 15th best choice. Wow.
Every single voting system has different incentive structures. It's not just, oh, this one's more fair than the other. Fairness in election voting systems is kind of like a nonsensical metric. Does it make, I would say what I want is coherent governments, coherent choices. So you have to prove yourself, in my mind, in first past the post, that you can have broad enough appeal that you can actually get large portions of an individual area, a selection of people to believe in you, not 1 out of every 300 people scattershotted across the country to like you. And even if it's a 5% threshold, well, that's still an arbitrary metric, but it can be overcome. But it allows for parties to get in who have specific pet issues, and they only care about that pet issue.
The one thing I'll add with that too,
Israel is a great example of a country where proportional representation, they kind of make it work, but it has a lot of flaws because you get a lot of governments that get in where they have, and because the small parties, their only mandate is to care about their 1 or 2 specific issues. So in Israel, you get a lot of ultra-Orthodox parties, the guys who, they don't actually work. It's like, just studying Torah all day long. The guys who wear like the hats, the black hats and coats and whatnot. They have a concentrated amount of political power and can keep governments in or out. And everyone else has to cater to their very oddly specific and often unreasonable demands. And they have no incentive to budge because it's not a big tent party where they can tick off their base by being unreasonable. Because being unreasonable is the point.
I'll add too, there's a really good example because oftentimes people will push for proportional representation, but then they'll want a gate threshold like 4 or 5%. And one of the main arguments for proportional representation is they want to get rid of strategic voting. Now, first off, strategic voting still exists without gating. But as soon as you add gating, you've now created a really stupid form of strategic voting. Because in normal strategic voting, in like first past the post, would be like your new Democrat voter votes for Trudeau because he likes Trudeau more than O'Toole, and the current NDP guy in this riding has no hope of winning. That's normal strategic voting. In a gated proportional system, you get a really stupid version of this. Sweden has this happen all the time, where you'll see like the moderate party underperform on election day, and like the Christian Democrats suddenly get like a half percentage point more votes, because in Sweden, if you have less than 4% of the vote, you get no seats. And the Christian Democrat Party and the Liberal Party in Sweden usually perform around 3-4% points in the polling. So then moderate party or Sweden party voters are like, oh, well, wait, we need these other two parties to form a government. We need them in our coalition. So I'm going to vote for like my fourth choice party because that party needs to win, get cross 4% to have seats. And I need them to have seats for me to form government. And it's just stupid.
And that's where first past the post is nice, because you would be like, oh, well, only 40% of the people who voted for them. And I always hate when people are like, well, they only technically have, technically 30% support because a bunch of people didn't vote and they don't represent them. Like, well, that's kind of tough if you don't vote. But like, what I want in government is coherent visions, not like compromise visions. People get their turn in government, and it should be something where you can each party gets to have its kind of turn. If you can get 42% of the population together, and the second closest people are at 30, and you're winning the majority, or the plurality of the vote in the majority of ridings, let's give you a spin. Let's let you have a try, because it's also very easy to get rid of these governments when they turn unpopular. Where the proportional representation, if they turn unpopular, like look at Portugal, look at Spain, the government can keep cobbling together new coalitions with its own disaffected old members who went over to a more left party, like so the socialists in Portugal and Spain. They'll hemorrhage a bunch of voters over to like the environmentalist party or the Marxist party or whatever, but they stay in because they're effectively their coalition. They almost just trick voters into voting for a slightly different brand of them that have to work with them if they want any power. Whereas, like, if you let the Conservative Party in Portugal or Spain, who's actually getting more votes than the Socialists, just have a flipping turn, they'd actually probably wildly increase in popularity, but there's just not enough voters who are moving over to them or their affiliates, like other parties that would work with them, to get something going. So you've only had one vision in places like Spain since like the 70s, even though everyone agrees that that party's not very good, because even though they've been around for decades and they've had their leader as the figurehead of the government in its like 3 or 4 party coalitions, they've still nobody likes them and still only pull at like 25%. But they're able to always slam together something new, which is insane. Like, and that's the problem, is it doesn't. I think Fine First Press, the post allows for very clear differences between visions.
I'll add too. This is another good example. So the Dutch had an election in 2023.
Also, I'm so sorry that I pushed everyone off. I pushed us off whatever topic.
Yeah, but this is interesting to talk about, so it doesn't really matter. So Dutch had an election in 2023, and this election, Dutch has no gating. So as long as you get like 0.68% of the vote, give or take, you get a seat, because they have 150 seats, so you get 1 over 150% of the vote, basically. But what this means, when you have no gating, you get this many political parties, and it takes forever to form government. It took to the 16th of May for a coalition agreement to be signed. And then it took to the 2nd of July for cabinet to form. It took nearly a year following an election for a new government to form. Because it was that hard for all these parties to come up with an agreement on who should be in charge, who should have what cabinet positions, what policies are we going to pursue as a government. Because turns out when you have this many parties, they all have different interests. And as Wyatt was pointing out, in something like for proportional representation, you're encouraged to be really hyper specific. And then it makes it very difficult because, okay, you have, for example, the PVV, which is essentially very broad strokes, just the anti-immigration party in the Netherlands. There's some other bells and whistles on it, but it's mostly anti-immigration.
Especially as they've grown, they've diversified a little bit more what their issues are.
But then you have something like the BBB, which is basically just like the rural farmer party. That's kind of like populist farmer party.
Go down to that orange one. It's just the rural Calvinist party, and they've gotten 2 seats since they've existed. Every single election's 2 or 3 seats, and that's it.
So you have all these different little parties, and then you have like things like the FVD, the J21, and a bunch of other ones that are like splinter parties of splinter parties of splinter parties.
Yeah. And the funny thing is that they're actually, in a certain sense, this whole system sells these parties short from what they should be getting in a first past the post system. Because in a first past the post system, a lot of these would have just formed together into their own big tent party. And they probably would actually get more representation of their views in a big tent party if they were running in nominations and, like American style primaries. They'd have more people across the finish line. Yeah, not under a very oddly specific banner, but that type of view that's being represented. And obviously in Canada, though, we do need to reform the nomination system. I would know that better than anybody, having been kicked in the face by it. But that I feel like that would be a better way of doing it. Plus, also, and there's almost a narrative like the Greens and the PPC are mistreated by our current system. PPC gets 5% of the vote and it wins 0 seats, and the Greens get whatever percentage of the vote and they get only 2 seats or whatever. And it's like, okay, well, maybe it's because you guys don't work hard enough. Like, it actually just comes down to that. Don't change the platform. Don't change anything. Here's a compliment to Elizabeth May. She won that seat because she worked her butt off for it in Sandwich and the Gulf Islands. She actually worked, and it wasn't that she had to work harder than everyone. She just worked like a major party would, for once. Most people who don't win seats as independents, or independents have a little bit of a problem because people do like the brand and it makes it a little bit confusing to understand you. But independents and small parties can win. They just don't put in the effort into these smaller ridings that a major party would. Even with Maxime Bernier and Portage de Luscar or his original Brand of Boast, he didn't work that hard. I've seen campaigns that work hard and campaigns that don't. And it's not out of reach for anybody. You can technically run a campaign for basically near $0. If you just have the right volunteers showing up and you know what you're doing, you don't have to pay for too much artificial door knocking or stuff. They just don't do it. And then the lack of proportional representation gets blamed on the fact that they don't get seats, even though their campaign, as they are running as many seats as candidates in another party, they didn't put in even a quarter of the effort in terms of they probably didn't door knock. I know tons of NPPC guys. They put their name on the ballot and they act very hardcore online. They never door knock a single day during the election. It's like maybe that's why you only got 4% of the vote in this area, which is actually kind of impressive considering.
There's one of the things I also find with this kind of argument too is people forget that there is more than one issue at a time. So you look at the Dutch here, right? You have parties that are, for example, like the BBB or this Calvinist party or the PVV, and they're basically single issue parties. And that's one of the issues that the People's Party and the Green Party have in Canada is they're basically single issue parties. You're not really getting anyone to vote for the Greens who aren't Category 10 climate change voters. There's very few people for them. But then you look at the parties who are actually serious, like the NDP, the Bloc, the Conservatives, the Liberals. The Bloc's a really good example of this. Who is the people who vote for the Bloc? You have separatists, obviously. You have just people who are Quebec autonomists. You have people who are just regular Quebecers who don't really like the other options, so they're vote parking, and everyone knows they're vote parking. And then you have people who like Canada, who want Canada to be a thing, but they want more perks. And the Bloc Québécois gives them perks. Those 4 people will vote for the Bloc. Those 4 people can be liberals, they can be conservatives, they can be socialists, they can be fascists, they could be communists. because all those other things don't matter, because the main goal of this party is to make Quebec get a bunch of benefits, right? Whereas
And I
for the
know there's a lot of
Greens,
PPC guys yelling at you right now saying, well, our party has tons of issues. Go look at the platform. Every single party, even in the Netherlands, who are single issue parties, do have full platforms. But the whole point is that the PPC has become the I'm against the establishment party. In a lot of ways, that's actually the problem with the Greens. That's actually why the Greens, the PPC, share a lot of voters. It's somebody who is just actually hates the current way everything is done. And that sounds broad, but it's also very specific in the sense that it's looking for a specific type of guy who hates effectively non-populist politicians. Because a lot of PPC guys agree with the conservatives on lots and lots of issues, but that doesn't matter because they're like establishment. So it's basically just the anti-establishment party. Like, we're the ones who don't put on suits and whatnot.
and that's
And as shallow as that sounds, that's frankly these days basically the appeal.
there's an interesting corollary to that too, which I was discussing the other day on Twitter, unrelated to this. But as we just touched on earlier in the podcast, so conservatives typically overperform polling, specifically because urbanization, rural urban polarization, and the rural areas are hard to poll. But an interesting corollary to that is the populist right is almost always overpolled, because the populist right are the kind of people, and these is like the People's Party in Canada, for example, are the kind of people who will go out of their way to answer polls. They will proactively answer polls on purpose. They will seek out answering polls on purpose. So you always get way more People's Party voters answering polls than there are actual People's Party voters if you assumed that this is proportional to the population at large. Because they're the most motivated to answer the polls, but there's actually the fewest of them.
Yeah, even the Green Party is like that. Not as much in the polls because they've been around long enough. I think the general hype of letting everyone know who you're voting for has died down a little bit because it's like an established brand now. But like the amount of Green Party people who exist on social media to advocate for the party is like way disproportionate to the amount of people who actually like them. It's because there's almost a fixed number of activists that exist in any party, no matter how big or small. It's almost like tiered. Once you move up from being a small party like the Greens, you get as many activists online as the NDP. And then when you move up to the major parties, you get as many as the Liberals and the Conservatives. But there's almost like 3 layers. But it doesn't matter how much more the Conservatives are pulling than the Liberals. The amount of online activists is a fixed number still.
You see this all the time right now, too. If you're on something like Twitter, there's 1,000,001 accounts. Oftentimes they'll pop up out of nowhere. And by that I mean they're not necessarily brand new accounts, but they'll suddenly gain a whole bunch of notoriety out of nowhere. And they're just like the most hardcore pro-liberal type possible, and not usually in a good way. They'll be like this guy and just straight up like denying the validity of the polling industry is entirely, which is just crazy. But then you'll see about the same number of conservatives like this. And depending on where you are in the cycle and which party's doing good or bad, the activists on one side or the other get more and more delusional, or less and less delusional. But since the number of activists is quasi-fixed, so if a party's doing really bad, those activists have to be delusional because that's the only rational position to have, which is kind of funny to say that.
Well, I mean, if there's a space of like 1,000 people on social media, the PPC and the Greens will always have like in a room of 1,000, each of them will each have like 100, and then the Conservatives and the Liberals will have 300 each, and then like the NDP will have a kind of middling amount. Not really the block because it's like that's French Twitter, a place that we do not go. But you get my point. Yeah. Like it's like there's just so it doesn't matter if your party has 1% up to 10%. You kind of you own 10% of the activists in the room because there's just a certain percentage of people. It's almost like fixed rate of crazy people who really care about politics who will be attracted to each niche or broad coalition party. But it's never like, oh, you're the Conservatives and you have 45% of the polls. Well, 45% of the activists are yours online. Like, no. You have your fixed number because there's only so many people who actually care that much. But now I'm repeating myself.
And there's another corollary to that too, is usually you'll see in like conservative or liberal spaces, you'll have a couple big accounts, and those big accounts suck up all the oxygen out of smaller accounts. But if you're in a the way social media works in general, actually, is that's how that works. Big channels or big accounts suck up the oxygen of smaller ones in that same sphere, in that same thing. There's a principle for this. I can't think of the name of it. Basically, you can look. I can't even think of how to explain it. But there's a.
social media.
Sorry, what did you say?
So I was gonna say social media kind of like works like a solar system in the sense that you have big accounts and then they have kind of like their orbiting vessels, their moons and whatnot. But the thing is that it's like you can't even see those smaller accounts unless you go directly to that big planet account and interact with it. Like there's tons of people. If you start interacting with a super big lefty guy, tons of these lefty accounts who like when you go through their timeline, they're prolific posters. But just based on the area that you are in, you will never cross over with them, and they'll never talk to you unless that bigger account puts attention on you or you put attention on them in like a very active way.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And I think that's one of the reasons too, in just more broad terms, I don't actually really like the idea of people describing like YouTube or Twitter or whatever as the town square, because the way these platforms work is they're anti-town square fundamentally, because you don't see on Twitter, you do not see NDP Twitter if you're on conservative Twitter. You don't see liberal Twitter if you're on NDP Twitter. You might have the occasional crossover account that straddles the line between the two different Twitters, or has a bridge because they are friends with someone on the other Twitter. But outside of those peculiar accounts that have those bridges or cross between two different ones, the crossover is almost zero. That's why if you go on something like Twitter and you run a naive poll, and when I say a naive poll, I mean like the built-in Twitter poll functionality, so like this. If you run a poll like this and you don't do any science to it, you don't do any weighting, you don't do any quotas, you just do a naive poll like this. And liberal Twitter is going to get like 80% liberal, conservative Twitter is going to get like 80% conservative, etc., etc. And that's why social media polls get a really bad rap, but then if you go and do all the actual science and data to them, then they're actually not bad. But turns out methodology matters. Methodology matters.
Yeah, I think a better way of also seeing Twitter rather than a town square, it's like a movie theater, and there's a lot of different screens, and you can go into the theater of your choice. And there's going to be kind of there's people of all types in all theaters, but they tend to concentrate in specific areas more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And
it's
every
like
once in a while, when a big blockbuster movie's on, there'll be a lot more than gather in one area.
and you also like that's why one of the reasons why when people say like you have to be careful what you read and say online, what you read online, it's not necessarily because people are trying to disinform you. I hate saying that word. They're trying to lie to you. Simple words are better than big words. Big words are stupid. I say as someone who loves putting big words in their written posts.
Incredulity.
Um, People aren't trying to lie to you, but what happens is they only see certain facts, and because of their political bias, they filter out the other facts. So you only get part of a story, which is why you'll have like the CNNs of the world. They are center left. They're not center left because CNN isn't necessarily purposefully trying to lie to you. It's because CNN is staffed with people who are mostly center left. So they talk about things that people who are center left care about.
Well, I was telling somebody, like, this was a while ago, I had this discussion, but like on the Covington Catholic story about Nick Sandman smiling in that native man's face and banging a drum, and everyone thinks he's being a jerk or whatever. But there was all the video out there that anybody who was like taking a fulsome view of it would have been like, yeah, he did nothing wrong. This guy approaches him, starts acting like a jerk. In fact, there was like black Hebrew Israelites conspiracy group of like black Americans who think that they're the real Israelites or whatever. Like they were the ones who started it, but it doesn't matter. And I've talked to people who are like, no, CNN was lying. They knew that this kid was innocent. They did it anyways. I'm like, do you think they want to get sued? No, they just have such a strong bias. against all of the factors that were going on in that video. White kid, Catholic, religious, Republican, MAGA Republican, and they see the few clips, and it's just that all the wires connect for them, and they think it's a story. No, and it's almost impossible to think like they both kind of knew they were lying at the same time they didn't, in the sense that they kind of knew they probably should have looked into it a little bit more, but their biases make them feel like, no, it has to be the way we think it is, because look at these factors, even though, like, you would say those are very minute details of the video, him smiling in the guy's face looking rude, even though there's like minutes and minutes and minutes elsewhere that show that this is not how it went down. But that's how bad information gets out there most of the time, is somebody's biases make it impossible for them to see the most obvious things.
I'll also say as a tangent to this too, you see this every now and then. People are like, aha, this particular politician is an idiot, they're a moron. There's a post couple going around the other day after the US vice president debate where people were saying, Kamala Harris has 85 IQ. So first off, that's absolutely ludicrous. Like, the idea that you're going to have someone who passes law school, passes the bar, is an attorney, has a ostensibly successful career as attorney, becomes a senator, somehow becomes the VP, somehow becomes a presidential nominee, and they're borderline non-functioning for a military application? Sorry, no. And I'll caveat that and clarify this because people sometimes misinterpret this. I'm not saying people in the military are stupid. I'm saying that if you have 85 IQ, that there is no purpose the military has for you. There's nothing you can do in the military at 85 IQ that they will use you. You're not useful as a frontline soldier. You're not useful as a cook. You're not useful at peeling potatoes. They have no use for you. In the U.S., it's legally not allowed. They're legally not allowed to recruit you at 85 IQ. They don't call it 85 IQ. It's like a certain ASVAB score, but the ASVAB is basically an IQ test. But people have this weird perception that the politicians they don't like, because they're doing things they don't like, because they're pursuing policies they don't like, they must be stupid. Usually they're not stupid. Usually most politicians that you can think of, that you can name, are probably relatively smart. But being smart doesn't mean you're going to do things that are good.
Yeah, David Eby's not a stupid person, but but this is my thing from taking a master's in public policy. All it really taught me in a lot of ways was that I don't like policy people, because I find the way that they think is incoherent in a certain sense. It's all very complicated stuff. Someone will walk you through a research project they did, or their thesis or whatever, and it's all very complicated. They had to do, if they had to do all statistical regressions to try and prove the point that they have, that this factor is like a key element that we need to be treating if we want to raise more people out of poverty or whatever. And they're wrong, but it's almost, and that's where very smart people being wrong becomes very dangerous, is that they're very difficult to convince they did something wrong, because there is a lot of work that went into being wrong. And I think there's parts of David Eby in BC, to maybe get back to BC a little bit more. I was the one who sidetracked us from BC. Sorry, everyone. But that's the problem for David Eby. In the back of his mind, probably he knows a lot of stuff he's doing is wrong. At the same time, his mind couldn't probably comprehend that all of the stuff he's consumed for decades of his life, in terms of progressive policy and all the data and research he's read and all the different studies, could possibly be wrong. I had a guy the other day get mad at me online when David Eby, because even David Eby will have to wake up to the realities of what his policy on drugs has actually done. That when he was rolling out, we might be in favor of involuntary rehab, just like the conservatives. When you actually read the details of their policy announcement, it's basically, unless someone's unfunctional, they're not going to force them into rehab. But someone said, well, involuntary rehab doesn't work, because 4 years after someone leaves these involuntary rehab programs in other jurisdictions, they have a 4.4 times higher rate of mortality than the general public. And I'm like, that's really good, actually, but you lack the common sense to know that that's good. 4.4 times higher mortality rate for a 35-year-old leaving an involuntary rehab program only over the next 4 years over the general public who wasn't using drugs. That's great, because guess what? That person has severe, probably, organ damage. if they've been using crack or meth for a long period of time. So
Mhm.
why would you be shocked that that person might suffer heart failure? It'd be like if we had involuntary treatments for people who had anorexia, and we were surprised that they had like a 2 times higher mortality rate after leaving the program over the next 5 or 6 years. It's like, yeah, there's tons of people who recover from that, and they still die because they damage certain organs in their body from not eating food enough. Like,
I'll
what?
just
This person
add to specifically
and the person
about
who's disagreeing with me
meth.
isn't stupid. What?
So, specifically on meth. So, if you get addicted to meth, one of the chemical changes it does to you while you're on meth, the active effect of meth, is it causes euphoria. And it gets to the point if you do meth too much, which is like single digit number of times, it could be once. Your brain's pathways to feeling pleasure are completely fried, and it can take like a decade for your brain to recover from this. So a lot of people will get clean on meth and then within a few years kill themselves because they can't feel anything anymore. They're just meth recovery induces depression because their brain is fried. But if
And
you
then
don't get them off meth, they will also just kill themselves by taking the drugs.
well, that was ridiculous thing. And the thing is, the funny thing is, the person who's disagreeing with me, they're not like, it's not like some like 70 IQ person I'm dealing with. You have to be smart enough to even remember that this study exists. I've read it. Look, it's 4.4 times higher. It's not working. And it's like, but you just don't have the common sense to realize that the purpose of these programs is not to get to the person of perfect, because that's impossible. And they're not even thinking for a second, well, what's the results over 4 years of not treating somebody who's on the streets injecting things between their toes? Well, obviously they're probably not alive in a year. I mean, they're probably not even alive in 6 months. But the people will find, and I always derogatorily refer to them as studies. People will come at you with their study showing you that, oh, actually, if we just give people money, we can reduce crime. Because look, people commit crime in poorer neighborhoods. And that's what I did my master's research paper on, proving that that's not how that works. There's tons of low income neighborhoods with next to no crime because the people in them don't want to commit crime, because they have a confidence that if they work hard enough to get educated, that they can be rich. I mean, or not rich, but well off, comfortable. So a lot of areas with a lot of like heavier Filipino populations, Jewish, Eastern European immigrants in Toronto when I was studying this, compared to other places that had more people from Somalia, they were doing way better because there was way more fathers in the household and way more people who were passing high school. And so those people had a stronger confidence that they do the right things and work hard, they're going to be doing well. And then you have another community where they're going to have a poorer level of social stability and fewer people having the education to get past minimum wage or just wage jobs. Not that you can't still succeed, but that person's confidence in their ability to succeed is very low. That person's far more likely to join a gang, to steal, and a lot of other stuff. It has nothing to do with income level. Yes, you're not going to find a lot of thieves who live in upscale neighborhoods. Doesn't really come with the territory. That would also be like saying that like all criminals are poor because none of them are making legitimate incomes, or at least gang members, people who steal, they're not making legitimate incomes because no one would ever hire them. Doesn't mean they actually don't have a lot of money from running an organized crime, like crime family.
I'll add too, just to circle back a half step. So you look at something like drug deaths, right? And you're saying, involuntary rehab, you have a 4 times higher death rate than the average population. You look at the number one drug problem in the world, opioids, specifically fentanyl. The cause of the expected outcome of untreated opioid dependency within generally speaking, about 100% chance of happening is death. There's no one, period, ever and could ever happen who was left on fentanyl for a prolonged period of time and survive. They will always die. And the reason they always die isn't because people have this weird conception with drug addicts that the addict is just accidentally taking fentanyl. Oh, they meant to take heroin and they took fentanyl and they died. No, they bought fentanyl on purpose. Or they'll be like, oh, they took fentanyl and they messed up the dose because fentanyl is really potent, so a very small difference is a fatal dose. No, no, no. They took that dose on purpose. And you'd be like, but that dose is going to kill them. It's going to cause an overdose. Why would they do that? Because people who are addicted to fentanyl are essentially just trying to kill themselves. They don't think of it that way because their brain's no longer rationally functioning because they're addicted. That's the definition of addiction. But when you are that addicted to drugs and you're hopeless on the street, you're hopeless. Hopeless. That's the key. These drug addicts are hopeless. They don't have any hope left. They're not taking fentanyl. They're not doing drugs because it's fun. Aha, I like drugs. They're not doing it because they're partying. They're a homeless person, probably living in a tent if they're lucky, scrounging to get the next hit. No, they're not having a good time. They're doing this because they've given up on the world, and this numbs the world. And if this dose kills them, they don't care.
And that's what's so evil about the harm reduction policies of giving people hydromorphone pills because it's technically safer than using fentanyl. Because these people would literally just go and sell it and buy more fentanyl. They'll sell the hydromorphone for more fentanyl. And it's so obvious that if you just starve this person of resources to buy drugs, that would probably be the best way early on to their addiction to make sure that they're forced to do rehab of some kind. Or they're going to steal and then get thrown in prison pretty fast, and then they'll be forced to detox that way. And if people always say, "Oh, you can get drugs in prison," yeah, not that easy, not that easily. Let's be clear. But yeah, like that's always been that's what's so insane about all this is that like the current policy in BC is trying to like treat the symptom of the problem, not realizing that the people who are using these drugs don't have the ability to actually make decisions at this point. Because like I think another good definition of addiction is that it's your inability to enjoy anything else.
Mm-hmm. And it's very insidious with drugs like fentanyl or other opioids, because when someone is on fentanyl, they're basically a zombie. It essentially zombifies them. They don't really react to stimuli very properly. They obviously don't really feel pain anymore because they're really high on a painkiller. So they just kind of like stumble around the street, barely functioning. And it's very unsettling. And as we have seen, this is a very well established, proven fact. There's a thing called broken window theory. And it's basically true. And broken window theory states that if you see disorder in a neighborhood, it propels more disorder. So if the windows are broken or of the stores, people think, oh, this neighborhood isn't well maintained, no one cares about it, so they're more likely to do more egregious things here. They're going to steal more, or they're going to mug people or whatever, because it's not a reputable neighborhood. It's not a good neighborhood. It's not a neighborhood that anyone cares about.
And the specific example in broken windows theory, obviously relating to broken windows, is that one window's broken on a building, every single one of them will be broken by like the end of the week or the month. And this is specifically being studied in New York. So if like a factory, some abandoned factory, they just break a window, and then over a week, people are like, "This is where you break windows." It's almost like your lizard brain kicks in, and you're just like, "This is where all the crime is."
And this is where it gets really insidious with a lot of these drug policies, because people asking, for the most part, pushing things like safe supply are not trying to hurt people. They're genuinely trying to help, but they are very misguided in what they're actually doing. Because a lot of people don't really spend the time or effort to understand what drug addiction actually means, because it's depressing, it's very unsettling. It's kind of disturbing from this perspective of how fragile your ability to reason can be your ability to action as a person can be. Like a substance can just take away your entire personality completely, and it's gone. And that's very unsettling. But you can't solve the problem, which is the person taking the drug, without removing the taking the drug part. As I said, opioid addiction ends in death. 100% of untreated cases die. And they usually die, quote unquote, on purpose. Like they intentionally took a dose that is too high. You talk to addicts who survive these doses, and they'll be like, why did you take that dose? And they're like, well, I thought it was too much, but I didn't really care.
Well, and that's where all the people who are trying to solve the problem by swapping out the drug doesn't realize, like, making, let's say, even say hydromorphone, because it's quote unquote clean or something like that. Well, it makes their experience, their life, 50% better. It's like the problem's so bad, you would have to you even if you eliminated 90% of the effect, the person still couldn't hold down a job, because that's how strong it is. You have to 100% get rid of what they are currently using, because even a touch of it would make you, if you were at work, unable to work. So It's not like, oh, if they have a safe supply, now they can go to work. No, they can't. No, they can't. They're on disability for the rest of their lives, even if you were giving them something safe, let's say, in theory. For some reason, just can't kill them, and it can't even damage their organs, but it has, like, the symptoms. They would be unfunctional and unable to do anything, because it's just, that's how much it, like, numbs you out to the point where you don't want that person even, like, to try and operate a cash register, like, or, like, hold anything that's, like heavier than a pound, because they're going to drop it on their own foot.
And isn't that a thing that's kind of interesting too? Because this isn't like something that the average person has no experience with. Have you ever had a surgery, even like a really basic, very safe, very mild surgery, like getting your wisdom teeth removed?
There you go.
You have very likely have had a very significant painkiller in your system, and then experience what it's like afterwards. Now, a lot of people don't have as bad reactions as others, but there's people who you'll talk to after something like a wisdom teeth surgery, and they're loopy and completely out of their mind. And then you say, "Oh, we're going to give a drug that's significantly stronger than that to people, and that's fine. They're going to be able to function." No, they're not, and that's really.
I just find the whole concept of all the safe injection site stuff, even for lighter drugs, like, and we're talking about lighter, like crack, not compared to even hydromorphone. I think hydromorphone is actually supposed to be stronger than something like crack. I know those are like different types of drugs, but still, in terms of its ability to kill you. But like even then, like it's such a society on retreat type position that we're just going to make it so that your problem is slightly more manageable, rather than just like saying, no, you're not doing that anymore. And I saw the dumbest thing on the planet from this guy, Guy Filica. His like actual first name is Guy, and he's like, supposedly, when I say supposedly, it's not that he's not telling the truth, but he's like, I used to be an addict, and safe injection sites saved me or whatever. I think he was like addicted back in like the early 2000s, when like there wasn't things like fentanyl around. And like him advocating for like safe supply in this environment is just delusional. And I think I to a certain extent, a lot of these harm reduction people over time, I think they're liars in the sense that they know it's not working, but a bunch of them actually have money invested in this at this point. Like they are the people who drive around vans and hand out paraphernalia and safe supply drugs. They are literally invested in this being the right way of doing things. Not saying that they actively know every single day their life's a lie, but in the back of their minds, they don't want to get into the debate because they don't want to find out if they're wrong or not. And like with people like him, there's no way he actually thinks in the back of his mind that this is the same problem and that he's not just a crazy outlier that the safe injection sites helped.
When even with that too, right? Let's assume, hypothetically speaking, that the safe injection sites save numbers of people. Let's say it's like 10% of people eventually somehow come to their senses and get better. That still doesn't mean it's a good thing. If like 30% of their users die per year or per time period, the same time period that 10% survive and get clean, 30% die, that's still a bad system. You still should look for a better system. The goal of any kind of healthcare should be that the fewest possible people die. And the
Did you
problem
see
with
the row that? Did you see the row that happened on Twitter recently, where everyone was arguing? I like how I still just call it Twitter, not X, even as much as hard as I try. But did you see the row going on where people were trying to compare having like buying a beer at a convenience store because of what they're doing in Ontario to like, or having a beer at a bar to be like that's basically like what how a safe injection site works.
yeah, that's the most
Except that doesn't make any sense because you're more likely to have something bad happen to you going to a bar and having a drink rather than staying at home and having a glass of wine.
it's a very hilariously ridiculous position because even let's say for sake of argument, booze sold out of a 7-Eleven is the exact same thing as handing out hydromorphine at a safe injection site. Let's assume it's the exact same thing on a societal level. Booze is a very different drug. It's a very different drug. Most alcoholics live quite a long time and can be very functional. I'm not saying you should be an alcoholic. That's really bad for you. You will die, but it will kill you. But the functionality difference is wild. The willpower difference is very different. An alcoholic can, of their own accord, easily get better. If you're addicted to fentanyl, you probably won't get better on your own accord because when you're high on the drug, you are zombified. You're barely responsive to stimuli. Alcoholics are responsive to stimuli. It's just, you can't compare two drugs and say, aha, these two
But you know,
things are equivalent. It's
the
just
example was so
absurd.
ridiculous because the idea of like safe injection sites are they're good because well because if you're at home and you like you overdose who's going to save you kind of a thing and you're like your chance of dying are like heavily increased like your chance of dying at home by having a beer is actually like nil because like what's going to happen to you like where you're like because there's no chance you're driving unless you decide to go somewhere and drive you know you're not going to get to like a fight with somebody which even then like we're having to really scrape the bottom of the barrel of the ways that you're going to somehow die while you're out like that's ridiculous. You're literally safe for doing it from home. But like the problem with the injection sites is every user now basically lives on an island where they have to slowly walk down the rope bridge towards the place that they can use it at, where they don't die, then walk back. In the sense that they basically live between their house, the sidewalk, and the safe injection site. And if they deviate and use drugs anywhere else, they're dead. It's like so basically that's actually where Bonnie Henry in British Columbia, when she was saying that we should be selling safe supply drugs and whatnot in pharmacies, in a certain sense, her idea is coherent with NDP policy. Because if your idea is that the only place that people can be safe at with using drugs is the safe injection sites, well then we need more safe drugs to be everywhere and more places where people have like Noxolone kits or whatever. You know, like that's the logic that this needs to be everywhere, so these people have greater ability for mobility to get the drugs they need anywhere rather than just distribution points. Obviously they're wrong, but that's where I don't believe David Eby for 5 seconds. Even that's an exaggeration of how long I would trust him. When he says that he disagrees with Bonnie Henry when she proposed having it be like something that you can purchase safe supply drugs at pharmacies. Because based on everything they're doing, that's not incoherent.
And the other problem with that, too, and you could expand this to the whole alcohol discussion, but I'll pin that for momentarily. The problem at the end of the day of the people on drugs is they're on the drugs. You can make it as safe as possible, as Wyatt touched on earlier. You can make it so that there's a 0% chance he'll ever overdose. The fact that they're still addicted to drugs is a problem. It's bad for society. It's not good for them. They're not functioning as a person. It's bad for their family. They've lost a family member effectively. It's bad for society because we're spending a whole lot of resources just sustaining this person from dying when they can't do anything else. They can't be productive. There's no hope of them ever being productive. At least with something like an involuntary rehab, there is the hope at the end that they will be productive again. So it might cost a lot of money to put them in rehab, but at the other end of at the end of the rehab, they can be productive again. They can be part of society. They can return to their families, to their friends.
By the way, that's the logic behind incarcerating criminals. is that it costs more than not incarcerating them, obviously, but the kind of more passive societal effects, it actually is still more beneficial. Yes, the government would pay more on like having like whatever, like you're like not what word am I looking for here? But like there's other systems that they've used to like try and treat crime that technically cost less than incarceration. But when you actually factor in all the other stuff that it has a positive effect on by removing people who commit crime from society, it's obviously the better thing to do. Because like again, this is my master's degree research paper. This wasn't the main subject, but it was like a side, not discovery, but a side thing I kind of proved is that crime itself drives poverty more than the other way around. Crime will make people in an area poorer than poverty will make people do crime.
And I'll
And
just
again, you go to a Filipino neighborhood with a lot of new Filipino immigrants, which like that's a big new, group in many areas, like new immigrants from the Philippines. They will never commit a crime in their lives, no matter how low income they are. They will only ever work harder because it's just not in the DNA of the community to do that.
oh,
Whereas if I inject crime into an area, it doesn't matter how resistant people are to not wanting to be poor, it will force them into poverty.
I'll add to that too. When people say the opposite of your findings there, it does kind of have a very unsavory, kind of gross connotation to it to say that poverty causes crime, because it essentially is saying that the default human position is to be an immoral, horrible person.
Which in a
Because
certain sense it is, but not to this extent.
and that's a very gross thing to say. Like, poor people are bad people. Sorry?
I literally said that to someone. Is that it's and actually this is also saying from Actual Justice Warrior on YouTube. People should go look up AGW Actual Justice Warrior. But so many left wing politicians treat poor people like social invalids, and unless you're cutting them checks, unless you're doing this or that program, they're gonna fall apart. I mean, they're gonna like just start rioting. You'll have people literally make excuses for like BLM riots in 2020 for reasons like this. Well, oh, it's poor community. What the heck? That's the most racist thing I've ever heard because it's like a black community where there's like riots going on. Well, it's must because we just didn't give people enough money. That's not why. It's because you don't actually police crime. That's why that's why there's a lot of more poverty in these areas because politicians have clammed up and they don't want to enforce the law. That's actually something that happened in BC too. They've passed new ordinances on the police where you can get investigated as a department or a singular officer if your arrest records disproportionately target, quote unquote, people in specific demographic groups. So it's basically saying First Nations reserves which do have more crime on them, don't police them too hard, which means you're going to get more crime and people are going to become poorer, no matter how much money you give them, because it doesn't matter, because crime will eat up all that money.
And I'll just circle back to what I pinned earlier on the alcohol discussion. So let's say the safe supply people are correct, and 7-Eleven selling booze is the same thing to safe supply sites giving out free hydromorphine. Okay, if that is a correct argument, you are arguing for prohibition. You are arguing that we should ban alcohol as a substance. And maybe you want to argue that. And if you want to argue that, I respect that. But if your argument is alcohol is so dangerous, we should not let it be sold at a convenience store, it must be sold at a government store.
Have you ever heard the one where they always say that alcohol is more dangerous than all these opioids and whatnot because there's more raw number of people who die from it a year?
The classic per capita fallacy.
Yeah, I always hate that. As if, and that's honestly, that's always my argument against people when they're like, marijuana is still less dangerous than alcohol. And it's like, yeah, I get it that you can't really overdose on pot and kill yourself. But like we were saying, you can actually be an alcoholic and be somewhat functional, but you can't really be I guess like marijuana addict, which there actually are people like that, especially people who started young, who are actually kind of unfunctional in the sense that they can never get past a certain level of job because you're kind of always a little bit numbed out. I know tons of people who just are not very good employees because of it. Not that I'm going to suggest they take up drinking, but you know what I mean. Well, you get my point.
Yeah.
It's something easier to use all the time, where there's a social stigma about drinking at 9 a.m.
Mm-hmm. There should be a social stigma against smoking at 9 a.m. for weed, that is.
Yeah, but the thing is, because it's not really considered like an evening thing, where that's most people, if they have a drink, it's like in the evening, where
Mm-hmm.
like, you're having dinner. Well, nobody like, oh, I'm smoking pot because it's 10 p.m. Like, you just do it whenever, and you get a lot of people who like that's the things that you more easily fall into just using it all the time because there's no cultural standards around when it's okay and not okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the very difficult reality with a lot of these, with pretty much any discussion about drugs, is people don't want to have an honest discussion about drugs, be it alcohol, be it weed, be it something mundane like tobacco, or be it something like, aha, it's fentanyl. There's actually people who've argued to me before that we should legalize fentanyl because having fentanyl be illegal makes it more potent and that makes it worse, which is just a very wild take. Very wild take. Dumb take, but a very wild take. But the core issue with a lot of these discussions is people like to just be like, oh, all these drugs are bad. Therefore, we allow one, we should allow all of them, which is such a strange viewpoint. But it's gotten really popular among a lot of progressive types. They want to. You'll see people who are actively pushing for decriminalization and legalization of every single drug because some drugs that are currently legal are sort of dangerous. Like, for
And
example,
that's where I feel like those people are the ones where they believe what they say. At the same time, I feel like in the back of their mind they know they're kind of wrong, but it's not front of mind type stuff. Well,
mm-hmm,
that's why I always mean back of mind is like the person knows they don't want to get into a debate with you in it because the back of their mind has this niggling feeling that they're wrong. Now, I mean, and they don't want to talk about it. That's why I always find these people are very avoidant, dishonest. They genuinely believe what they believe, and this is the problem with dishonesty. Dishonest people don't know they're dishonest oftentimes. And this actually goes into all the time when you're talking to voters. Not that voters are dishonest, but my point is that people will often not say what they actively think, and they think that they think something else. It's actually so confusing getting to know where people actually are on issues when you do things like door knocking because somebody will say something that they think they believe. But if you just ask them a few more questions, you find out that that's not true at all, even if they said it very confidently to you. Like somebody says, well, the BC and NDP actually care about healthcare and the Conservatives don't. And I said, well, do the Conservatives not have a healthcare policy? Well, they do, and they're like, well, they propose doing anything, and then they'll actually get into nuance, and they actually believe, yeah, now every party actually has a pretty coherent healthcare policy, but their reaction and the thing front of mind that they think is Conservatives don't care about healthcare.
and that's actually a very interesting point there to make. Is that line that conservatives don't care about healthcare, don't think about healthcare? What that actually tells you is not anything about the Conservative Party. It tells you a lot about the NDP in the case of BC. And this is true for every policy you can possibly name. The party that people attack over perceived failure in policy usually tells you that they think their party has a better brand on that policy. They're not saying the NDP is better at healthcare. They're just saying that the NDP brand cares more about healthcare than the Conservative brand does, which obviously is going to happen in a country where you have more than one issue because you can't talk about the economy, healthcare, drugs, crime, every other housing, like all these. You can't talk about all these things equally. You don't like if the Conservatives spend 1 unit of time talking about all five of those things, and the BC NDP spends 3 units of time talking about healthcare. They're like it looks like they're talking about healthcare a lot, and you don't care about healthcare because you're only talking about it
And here's
fifth of
another
the time.
and here's another front of mind, back of mind thing. Everybody in the back of their mind knows that no party is actually going to run on privatizing healthcare in the Canadian provincial election. There's nobody who is going to do it. Even the PPC does not do that federally. They do not run on privatized healthcare. They'll talk about virtues and adding it into the system. But even voters themselves know that nobody's actually proposing that because they, in their own minds, know that nobody would be dumb enough to run on that thing that's bad. So that's where always like voters can be weird, and also commentators who play into stereotypes. All these guys on TikTok, these Steve Boots types, Frank Dominic, that guy Creek Pete, they will very much just say the stereotype of what each party thinks, even though you know better that no party's going to run on ending private public health care. Nobody's going to run on just dismantling trade unions or whatever. That's what they tried to hit me on in British Columbia, that I'm like want unions dismantled when I'm just opposing somebody who labels themselves in their own bio as a candidate as a trade unionist. In which, if you know anything about trade unionism is not I like unions, or it would just be called I like unions. When you call it something an ism, there's like deeper beliefs to it. But nobody actually, and that's why their thing fell flat. Nobody actually thinks anyone's fighting unions in an election, because nobody's stupid enough to do that in an election, anyways.
Mm-hmm. And that's really an interesting overall point about how you campaign in elections, because it's not so much that you're campaigning about, here's the things I care about, or here's what we're going to do, and all these things. To a certain extent, you kind of have to push and pull on these baked in stereotypes of parties. If you've ever, I'll give you an analogy. If you're in a martial art, if you ever practice a martial art, I myself have practiced karate for many, many years. If you are trying to take down somebody to the floor, you don't just crush their arm and crumple it to a pulp. You use their arm and their body weight to knock them to the floor. And that's kind of what you're trying to do with campaigning on this. You're using this stereotype that the other party's feeding into, that your voters are feeding into, and you're trying to use that to pivot it into, wait a minute, what? And then you win. And that, when I say that, wait a minute, what? That's the reaction of the voter. So you go to the door and someone's like, oh, the BC Conservatives don't care about healthcare. What you do is you try to pivot it in their mind by saying all these other things. And then if they realize, wait a minute, they do care about healthcare, then a lot of their other talking points that the BC NDP might say, immediately wait a minute, can I trust anything this party says?
I 100% had that happen at a door, where when someone brought this up, I would pivot to, well, at the end, I would bring up this point that someone actually told me about, and it's a great example. When they talk about the Conservatives don't care about healthcare, I always reference how much of our administration, or how much the healthcare system spends on administration these days under the NDP, and how little frontline spending actually occurs. And then we're in an interesting argument where we're no longer talking about, well, the Conservatives don't care about healthcare, because I'm pointing out how we have, in a certain sense, a more caring view than the NDP, because we're being very considerate about how much is actually going towards healthcare. And now it's a different conversation other than who's going to spend the most dollars on it, because that's usually where the one-dimensional view of the issue when you first start out. Or are you going to propose increasing spending more than the other guys? Oh, that must mean you care compared to the other person. It's like, no. How much are they actually spending on healthcare? How many people working in administration are currently registered nurses and could be helping the front lines but aren't, because we've made make-work type jobs that nobody actually needs done for them to do, that pay more for no reason? There's so many upper middle class people that once you bring up that, even though they're default NDP voters, they'll be like, yeah, that really drives me up the wall. And then you kind of access that back of brain information in their heads where they're like, yeah, no, I went to the hospital and you can't get a single nurse to even notice you. And there's all these people going around just telling you that we're full or you had to wait another 5 hours. You're like, what are those people doing? There's tons of people sitting around here who don't seem to be nurses.
There's an interesting broad point on this across many fields across society right now. It's really notable in university tuitions, less so in Canada than the US. It's really bad in the US, though it is a thing in Canada, where somehow the upper middle management has just exploded across the board to the point where you're just left wondering, what do these people do? They're not adding anything to society. For example, university. The university percentage of tuition spent on administration costs has increased, I believe, I'm quoting off the top of my head, so I might be not 100% correct on this number, but I believe it's something like 10-15% per year is increase on administration spending when inflation's 3%. And I don't know anyone who's ever attended university is like, ah, yes, everything about this program was really smooth, slick. It was easy. There wasn't any complications or headaches. Everyone has a whole host of problems. So if they're, and you ask someone who went to university 30 years ago, they had the exact same problems. So you're like, okay, if we have the exact same problems 30 years apart, but we're spending like 300% more money on administration costs, what is this going to? And it's usually going to paying people who have fake jobs.
Yeah. Well, and it's always a new novel position. They're not usually even adding more support to a department. So, registrations at universities are always often overwhelmed. At the same time, there's always a new person who's in charge of some DEI type office, or they're some manager of something vague, like, oh, I'm the mental health coordinator or manager or whatever, and I study this or that. It's never the person who's like, they never throw more money behind updating the website, because every university I've ever looked at has a horrible registration website that's incoherent, and you have to go through like 7 layers of pages to find the thing that you need, even though in what you're thinking, like, this is something that everyone will have to access going here, but it's harder than finding the FAQ page that doesn't help you at all. Find like incoherently, oddly specific things that nobody's going to have a problem with.
And there's another interesting thing related to this too. I don't know what the numbers are for Canada, but I've seen numbers similar in the U.S. and it's similar here too in Canada. But you look at public school spending. So public school spending across the board has been increasing faster than inflation. But a lot of this is going to filling out, again, these kind of administrative positions at schools. We're not hiring more teachers. Teachers are growing. Teacher salaries and teacher positions are growing at inflation/population growth rates. So it's not that. It's not disciplinary boards like the principal and other stuff like that. That's roughly inflation/population growth wise. But you're getting a huge surge of like administrative staff in the school districts and school boards. And what is it doing?
The Calgary Board of Education, for every dollar spent on school building teachers, there's like another dollar spent on the Calgary Board of Education, because there's a lot more people than you would think just sitting around CBE offices, just ruminating about curriculum and studying curriculum and stuff like that, which is insane, because at one point Alberta and British Columbia and several other provinces had like some of the top education systems in the world. Like, it was like the best public and charter systems. And for some reason, they kept tinkering with curriculum. And it's because their incentive is to tinker, because they're being paid to tinker. They can't just say, we haven't done anything this year because the curriculum is objectively great. Or you're like, oh, wow, okay, well, you're fired. Thanks for doing the best job you possibly could have, because it's all great now. Bye. Because a lot of these positions, in a certain sense, you might as well just be a plumber. Because once the job's done, you should be able to move on. And then every once in a while, they need someone to hire just to update the social studies curriculum, because it's been 10 years. And we just want to add a couple more like historical events that happened in the last 5 years for students to talk about in class. And that's it. But like, so they should be moving on somewhere else. But your incentive is now to make sure that there's always something that seems broken enough that you can keep, twisting metaphorical pipes together, seeing if it fits.
And this actually kind of links together a lot of things we've been talking about in the last 40 minutes. If you ask somebody for a solution to a problem, the person or the person you're asking is going to get your response. There's a very glib thing you will hear about in medicine, where you ask a specialist and they will tell you that your problem is their specialty. You go to an oncologist, you have cancer. You go to I can't think of any other doctor specialties, but you go to another one and they'll tell you it's their problem. A neurologist, they'll say you have a brain problem, etc. And what you get is the person you're asking for advice, or the person you're paying for advice, is going to give you advice that gives them jobs, usually. Now, some people are really good and really honest and they won't do this, but in general terms, the person will tell you that your problem is the thing that they can solve. And it's not necessarily scummy, like, aha, I'm going to try to steal money from you. It's more like they're trained and paid to look for things to look for. It's the hammer and the
Chiropractic.
nail thing. If you're a
Oh,
hammer,
chiropractic.
everything looks like a nail. If you job in your job history is finding problems in school curriculum, every school curriculum will have problems in it. So you're just gonna be like, well, there's problems in the curriculum. We need to change it. But that will always be true. So then you never stopped. So you're just always
Especially when
paying this
there's no
person to just
objective,
do it.
especially when there's no objective measure of what's a problem. Anything could be considered a problem if it's like, oh, we didn't talk about this enough in this, or the thing that really happened. I noticed in Alberta when they started changing things, we went from at one point literally rated as basically the best school system on the planet, compared to like national averages. Maybe there's like certain provinces or like prefectures in different countries that had better, but like we had in terms of like a fulsome education, because other countries like in Asia obviously have like really good math programs, but we have like really good writing, really good social studies, really good you know like like everything was just considered like really top notch in Alberta. But they started trying to teach math like everyone had ADD, because they're like, oh, we're leaving kids behind who have ADD, so let's break everything up into 17-step approaches to teaching math because that helps this specific kid in the class. Okay, well, unbeknownst to them, everyone now is worse off in math because you are teaching math for somebody who has a hard time focusing and making it so that they have these pathways of being able to do a question in these 17 small steps to kind of keep them on track. Whereas everyone else is like, it's like I don't even know what we're talking about once we're at step 10 because it feels too abstract now because everything feels too like, there are people who need fewer steps to actually know how to do it.
Mm-hmm. And that is why you have to be very careful on who you ask what the problem is. You ask someone, aha, why people will make work for themselves. And it's just a very unfortunate thing. And for some reason, the last 30, 40 years, we just keep funding more make work programs. I'd be willing to bet right now, Canada and every province in the country as a whole combined, our combined deficits are entirely caused by completely pointless spending. Not like, oh, this was a dumb program. Not, oh, well, maybe we shouldn't pay for pharmacare or whatever kind of thing like that. No, it's going to be like, yeah, actually, we have like $80 million of salaries at this one institution that doesn't do anything, and then we have another $100 million of salaries over here, and then the maintaining maintenance of this building to fit all these people costs like $10 million a year, and then you start adding all that up, and you're like, wait a minute, we're spending like billions of dollars a year on just pointless stuff.
There was a diversity coordinator in Calgary specifically for bike lanes. As incoherent as that sounds, that was a position. Somebody who was like, I don't know, monitoring the diversity of people using bike lanes and trying to like promote it to different communities or something. It was like ridiculous, and they were getting like six figures.
There was a good example as recently. So the University of North Carolina laid off a bunch of DEI positions, and they laid off 59 people, and those 59 people collectively were paid 17 million USD dollars in compensation.
Per year.
Yeah, collectively paid 17 million a year in compensation. Like that's about 200,000 US per person. And it's like there's no way that they're making anyone's lives $200,000 a year better.
You know what? There's no chance of either that those people knew that they weren't working a fake job. They knew they were working a fake job. I think everyone, again, you don't wake up in the morning thinking I'm going to my fake job, but again, it's a back of the mind thing that if this person had to justify their position, you'd get really, really hairy fast.
I mean, trying to justify your position on the diversity of bike lanes. How do you even articulate that to yourself? How do you sell that to yourself?
Honestly, probably be saying insane, like, white people are encouraged, like, have like physical fitness culture, and they're the ones who go biking, but other communities need to know about, like the benefits of riding a bike because it's just not part of their community or culture to, go for a Saturday morning bike ride and with what if you're not just going to work. I don't know, but that's my best guess. But parties, to go back to political parties, even with their tight budgets, have useless jobs inside them, and that's the thing that will drive me up the wall when I will jump around. And I've been around tons of campaigns. A lot of campaigns are actually run like tight ships. Everyone there needs to be there. Tons of campaigns where thinking about it, how many donors come together in a given year because of how much you're capped on. How many maxed out donations is this person's salary per year to work here, or even wage for the month, and how little they're doing? Think about how difficult it is to get people to donate that money to you, and how this person's basically wasting it having meetings and focus groups about nothing.
Yeah. And that's one of the issues too, because a lot of these jobs you'll find in political parties, in schools, in hospitals, the reason why the administrative positions can just bloom out of control that add no value is because they're very detached from any metric that you can really say is value. Let's take this example of a school. You have a teacher, and you can say, okay, this teacher has their classes are hitting this average grade point, and we're aiming for the average student to be around this grade. And then you can compare from there. You can look at a principal and be like, okay, either what is the disciplinary problems like in this school? Blah, 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 blah. What are the teachers like in this school? Are they behaving properly? Blah, 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 blah. You look at someone who's the diversity coordinator for a school, like how do you know if they've done their job properly?
And I find often what happens is that somebody can justify their position just on the basic idea that, well, administration is needed. Because technically, some of the administration is absolutely needed. You could not do without floor managers and shift managers for a hospital making sure that people are, that every unit's staffed properly. But all the HR people and all the diversity coordinators and whatnot, all the mental health managers and stuff attached to that person can kind of almost crib off of the value add that administration naturally has, and then hide within the details that, well, if you got rid of me, you don't realize that you'd actually lose a lot of value or something like that, when there's no real way of measuring it. And again, yeah, like you're right, you can get, and then end up hiding in kind of the crowd. Like, did you see that stuff in Silicon Valley where I loved the term corporate pets? All of
Mm-hmm.
these young 20 somethings who are like diversity coordinators or content leads or whatever for LinkedIn or these places, and they're like filming on TikTok their day at work, and you're like, you don't do anything. You actually don't do anything. It's anything that somebody else could do. Like, they're like, oh, and I go to the quiet room, and then I go and touch this wall because it's made out of this really kind of this fun textured material, blah 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 blah. And today they're serving this at the lunchroom, and here's the snack table, and here's the ping pong room, and it's like, what the heck is going on at these places? But like, when you're big and successful, like a lot of these companies, the amount of spending on these people is massive, but it's kind of like diffused out enough that they're not quite able to see that each department probably has millions of dollars of wasted
And
spending.
that's
Because
where you get these
not like, you can't be sure that that person's not doing anything until you do like an audit.
and that's where you get these problems, especially when it's government budgets, but this happens in any sufficiently large organization. You look at, like, for example, the Nova Scotia budget. It's very opaque where that spending is. And you're like, oh, well, this one person's salary is only like 100 grand. Like, that's nothing on the or like the $8 billion you're spending or whatever it is this fiscal year. Okay, that's true. But then you start having like thousands of those people, and it's suddenly, oh, wait, this is a lot of money. And that's the problem with a lot of these things is it's very diffuse, and it's also a reason why it can be really hard for voters to care about it, because the actual individual voter is spending essentially a negligible amount of money paying this person. Like, it's like maybe a penny. But then when you have thousands and thousands of people and processes that are each taking one penny from you, well, now you're talking about lots of tax dollars, a very substantial amount of money. You have 1,000 one-penny processes. That's now $10. That doesn't sound like a lot of money, but would you rather have $10 or these random processes that don't do anything? Then if you have 10,000, it's $100. Like, it starts ramping up pretty quickly.
One example of welfare spending in the United States, where if you just gave people their chunk of the amount of money spent on the system, you would like over triple their benefits, just because there's so many people there's so many middlemen between getting the money from taxpayers and then processing it and giving it through different benefit programs to people who qualify, that you end up wasting well more than like multiple times more money than you would actually have given them through these programs, and oftentimes the value is not even really the same because you're giving it to them through like food stamp programs, which actually limit the amount of value that the spending money that it represents is, because you can only buy so many products because only certain things qualify. Where you could have just given that person like $3,000 a month.
Another good example of this, I don't recall all the details of this, so I'm not going to say like this hard and fast rules, but there was a study that came out recently for homeless spending in California and San Francisco specifically. And they determined that the way this spending is distributed is the San Francisco / California governments tender contracts to private nonprofits and or charities to administer and distribute this charity to homeless people, because obviously the state doesn't actually have the capacity to do it themselves. They don't have people on staff who can do this. So they tender it out to charities and stuff. But people followed through this spending, and basically half the spending that San Francisco / the California government collectively spend on homelessness in San Francisco is just absorbed in administrative costs. So they spend like $40,000 per person per year or something like that is the number quoted, but like $20,000 per person per year is just absorbed in administrative cost, and you're like, wow.
Couldn't you just have a few people just cutting checks to homeless people, and they would actually technically be like middle class almost?
Yeah, I mean, if you take two homeless people and you pay them $40,000 a year, you're now an $80,000 a year household. That's pretty good.
Yeah.
But
and that's what makes the whole thing so absurd, that like all these, and the problem is, oftentimes I think bureaucracies, everyone does it at some point. Everyone's invested in keeping everyone employed, because if cuts start being made, I think everyone fears that they might be the one to get cut. So you almost are like now in solidarity with useless people, even if you might be one of the useful ones.
And it can be really difficult to tell who is useful or useless, because some of the jobs are obviously useless, but some of the jobs are like, is this useless? And I can't take any like concrete examples because this gets really like dredgy and nebulous really quickly, because there's no objective way to assess, is this person at the Ministry of Homelessness or whatever it's called in California, are they doing their job properly? Are they adding value? That's really hard to assess, but clearly they're not, because half the money being spent is just wasted. Not even getting to the person.
The person in theory could be hitting it out of the park in terms of their work ethic and job, but you just don't need them. And this is why you get terms like club fed that get invented. I think it was really funny when Rupa Subramania had posted how ridiculous these new labor policies were, where federally regulated workers cannot be required to do overtime work or stay after work hours, like after 5 p.m. The right to log off. And it's like, she's saying that this doesn't apply to people in like private businesses, where maybe your work does kind of take advantage of you a little bit, saying, oh, well, we need you to stay late to do this or that, and they're not paying you anymore for it. And really, it's like, it's not like this is really something that is well more than your own job description or whatever. But like this is only applying to like federal workers who are sitting at home playing Tetris, not doing really anything, and you're like, hey, boss man, you can't make me play another game of Tetris after 5 p.m. I get to go home and do it there instead. A lot of these jobs where there's no actual work that you're required to do, or you're just filing reports and updates and just going to meetings about nothing, and you're now no longer required to do that after work hours end, even though the amount of work you're actually doing is so sparse. And a lot of the times it's formulaic too, so it's not like you're solving new problems. You're basically in charge of taking in like efficiency reports about something, and it doesn't matter how inefficient or efficient what you're managing is. You just take in the reports and collect them, and nothing ever gets done because you're not in charge of actually fixing the problem.
And then there's also another category as well of this, which is these are more private sector oriented, but it's completely useless jobs that are actually useful, but only because the state requires that this job exists. And that is people who deal with trying to path their way through the complexities and annoyances of the regulations that we put on things for no discernible reason. I can't speak in concrete details for obvious reasons, but at my work we're doing a demo at another place in the same city, but because we're taking stuff out of the building, we have to get a whole bunch of rigmarole and processes, and it's like literally dozens of work hours from quite highly paid people are being spent to comply with a regulation to bring something from one side of the city to a slightly different part of the city.
Well, people also don't take into account when with getting rid of the carbon tax, one of the probably honestly the bigger benefit might be that you get to dismantle the infrastructure that collects the carbon tax and like measures carbon output to like tax companies for and whatnot. You'd probably be able to just like get rid of or redistribute the labor of 10,000 federal employees who have something to do with the carbon tax.
There was a good example of exactly that in France a while back. They had a wealth tax going on. And they ended up cutting the wealth tax, not because it didn't raise the revenue, but because the cost of figuring out how much to tax people cost more than they would ever get in taxes. Because it would basically require for every multi-millionaire in France who qualified for the tax, they had to have like a whole dozen people spending their entire calendar year just mapping their assets, figuring out their trades, figuring out what things they've bought and sold that count towards the tax, getting a really high fidelity estimate of what this person's net worth is. And it's like an incredible amount of work.
And then that individual is probably going to have lawyers who rightfully point out that you can't be pricing this stuff at the value where you are because there's differences between actual value and resale. And hey, you can't say that that car's 45,000. It's 10 years old. It should be like 20 or whatever.
And then there's all this arguing back and forth, and it ends up costing a ludicrous amount of money on not just the government side, but also society's side, because the multi-millionaire dude's still paying this tax that didn't cover the cost of collecting the tax. So everyone has lost in this exchange. The multi-millionaire dude lost a lot of money to taxes. The regular taxpayer lost money because the tax net lost the money. So everyone lost. It was just a lose kind of thing. And you see this a lot of these things because it turns out it's very complex to adhere to regulations. It's very complex to measure things. It's not a simple thing. That's one of the reasons why income tax is such a common tax in robust tax across the world. It's not because income tax is the best tax to charge. It's because income tax is like the simplest tax to charge. The company reports how much money you make, and then you just take money from that person. It's very simple from the government side.
Yeah, I know. And that's why as a policy person who has gotten a master's, it only makes me hate policy and regulations more. I have had people say things to me that make me want to like commit homicide when they're like, on page 86, I think they had a really good nuance on this bill on how to implement the specific part. I'm like, I'm going to kill you if you ever compliment something that's more than 10 pages for policy. The thing is that there are actual people out there who believe that the nuance and detail of policy makes it better. When I've wanted to do this both in BC, if the Conservatives win re-election, or the Conservatives beat the NDP and form government, I want to do this in that government, is just go through different departments and just start slashing regulations. Just take 5 people, say we're going to go through all agriculture policy, get some people with backgrounds. We're just going to take highlighters and highlight through every single regulation that makes no sense being here. Because even if it doesn't matter and that policy isn't, or that regulation or whatever isn't hurting anybody, the fact that it's even in a book, making it longer is a travesty and makes it harder to comprehend the stuff that you actually need to know.
A good example of this on the concrete level is talking to a housing developer in Halifax area. And he was telling me that apparently, according to the city, based on the, I'm not sure if it's city or provincial legislation, but one of the two governing bodies, I think it's the city maybe, has regulation on the board that you can only request approval to connect to water and sewer on a built property you're about to start developing on. So he was telling me that the natural thing to do if you're developing a whole street is you'd want to apply for every single house to connect to water sewer at the same time. Because it's easy on the first pass when you're installing the water sewer to just connect everyone. That's the easiest thing to do. It's the cheapest thing to do. It's the fastest thing to do. But you're not allowed to do that. You have to apply per house when ground is being broken. You cannot apply to a house that has no ground being broken. And the original rationale behind this regulation is people would apply and then just not build the house. So then they would have water connections that lead to nowhere, which adds wear and tear on infrastructure and annoyance and stuff like that. But to solve that problem, you create another problem where you add a huge amount of cost. Well, not a huge, it's overselling it, but you add a lot of cost to every single house because you make developers build more inefficiently.
Isn't that kind of funny too, that it's almost acknowledging the fact that you're going to get as far as requesting the water lines to be put in, and then you're probably going to balk at the other regulations than just to say this is impossible. So they're almost adding in more ridiculous regulations, realizing that people are going to realize the regulations are ridiculous, potentially have ordered the water lines to be put in, and then walk away because they realize the costs are so much higher. This is just impossible to do. So you're adding more obnoxious things in line. You're adding in more obnoxious steps because the other steps are so obnoxious. You want people to wait till the end to realize if they're actually wanting to jump through all these hoops, because no one's going to build a house that they don't have the capital for. They're going to put all the capital for together. The only thing that they could miss out on is not realizing that the amount of government interference could actually cause this project to balloon in price. And so now the government's basically saying, you don't realize how stupid we are. You can't ask for the water to be put in until afterwards, because we might really mess this up.
Basically, yeah, that's kind of exactly what that regulation is. I never thought about it that way, but that's a really good way to put it.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Anyways, well, I think the moral of this episode is that the government sucks.
Yes. It could be better though.
Yeah. We're not libertarians here. I don't want no government. I want like less stupid people, because no government's not an option.
Mm-hmm. It's a very not libertarian podcast.
Yeah. And we can explain to people why libertarians lose elections too. But that will be another episode.
But with that, I think that's a good time to wrap up here. We've gone prattling along for a while now, but anyone who actually makes this point, comment below that you're a cool dude. Bagel Club.
You're going to have one person get to the end and say that, and all the people who only get to 10 minutes but see their comment are just going to start saying, I'm part of the Bagel Club too, and it's going to throw off the entire sample.
But it'd be really funny.
Cool.
With that, though, we bid you guys adieu, and I'll see you probably Friday with a different video, but we'll see. We'll see on my scheduling. With that, though, bye.